They laughed at him in front of everyone. A man in a faded work shirt walked into a room full of expensive suits, carrying a dented toolbox and a small toy airplane. They saw a relic. They saw a mistake. The 30-year-old CEO, brilliant, ruthless, and untouchable, looked him up and down in front of hundreds of executives, engineers, and investors, leaned into the microphone, and said it out loud. "You're not what we need here." What none of them knew, what none of them bothered to find out, was that the man they were humiliating had once helped build the very aircraft they couldn't fix. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Like, stay with me till the end, because this one matters. The morning started the way bad days usually do, quietly, without warning, giving no sign of what was coming. Mason Cole woke at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm, the way he always did. The apartment was dark and still. He lay there for a moment, listening to the sound of his daughter breathing through the baby monitor on his nightstand. She was 6 now, too old for it maybe, but he kept it anyway. Some habits you hold on to not because they're practical, but because they remind you of when you first started holding on. He got up without hitting snooze. He never hit snooze. That was one of the few things that hadn't changed. The kitchen was small, a 2-burner stove, a refrigerator with a crayon drawing of an airplane taped to the front, a window above the sink that looked out over a parking lot. He made coffee in a French press his wife had bought at a weekend market 6 years ago. The glass was cracked along one side and he'd wrapped electrical tape around it so it wouldn't leak. He kept meaning to replace it. He never did. While the coffee steeped, he walked to the second bedroom and stood in the doorway. Lily was asleep on her side, her dark hair fanned across the pillow. One arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald for reasons she'd never fully explained. She looked like her mother when she slept, the angle of her jaw, the way her brow relaxed. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went and got dressed. Check. The call had come 3 days earlier and Mason almost hadn't answered it. He didn't recognize the number. He almost never answered numbers he didn't recognize. Too many debt consolidation calls, too many extended warranty offers, too many reminders of a version of his life he'd been slowly paying off for 4 years. But something made him pick up. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain why. "Mr. Cole?" A woman's voice. Young, efficient, no wasted breath. "This is Rachel Thorne calling from Vantage Aerospace. I'm reaching out on behalf of our CEO, Evelyn Hart." Mason had been standing at the kitchen counter, eating cold leftover pasta out of the container. He put down his fork. "Vantage," he said. "Yes, sir. I imagine you're familiar with—" "I know what Vantage is." Everyone in private aviation knew what Vantage Aerospace was. It had been built from a regional charter service into one of the most recognizable names in private aviation in under a decade. 12 aircraft in the fleet, contracts with Fortune 500 companies, foreign dignitaries, a handful of celebrities whose publicists never confirmed or denied anything. Evelyn Hart had taken over at 28 after her predecessor, a 70-year-old founder named Gerald Whitmore who had built the company from scratch, had a stroke in the middle of a board meeting. She'd turned what was becoming a comfortable mid-sized company into something that scared its competitors. Mason had followed the company from a distance the way mechanics follow certain aircraft, not because he had any stake in it, but because he'd spent enough years around those machines to feel something like attachment. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties with the fleet," Rachel Thorne said carefully. "Systemic issues. Our engineering team has been investigating for 11 weeks without a conclusive resolution. Ms. Hart has authorized me to reach out to a small number of independent specialists." "I'm not a specialist anymore," Mason said. "I'm a maintenance tech at a regional airfield. I fix single-engine Cessnas and the occasional corporate prop." A pause. "We're aware of your current position. Then you know I'm not who you're looking for. Ms. Hart reviewed your previous work history. She has some questions she'd like to ask you in person." Mason looked down at the pasta container. He looked at the crayon airplane on the refrigerator. He thought about what Lily's after-school program cost per month, and about the transmission in his truck that had been making a sound for 2 weeks, that he'd been pretending not to hear. "What does it pay?" he asked. Rachel Thorne told him. Mason was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to arrange childcare," he said. He drove 4 hours to get there. Vantage Aerospace's headquarters was in a converted industrial complex 40 miles outside the city, a glass and steel structure that had been redesigned so aggressively it barely looked like it had ever been anything else. There were sculptures in the courtyard, a reflecting pool, a lobby with 20-foot ceilings, and a receptionist who looked at Mason's truck when he pulled into the visitor parking and then looked at Mason when he walked through the door with an expression that said, "These are not the same category of person we usually see here." He'd worn his cleanest flannel shirt. He'd thought about wearing something else and then decided against it. He didn't own a suit, hadn't since the funeral, and that one was in a garment bag in the back of his closet that he didn't open. The receptionist gave him a visitor badge and told him to wait. He waited 45 minutes. He used the time to study the lobby. There were framed photographs along one wall, aerials of the fleet, publicity shots of aircraft against dramatic skies, a portrait of Evelyn Hart in what looked like a hangar, wearing a hard hat and looking directly into the camera with the kind of expression that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and I need you to know that I know." She was younger than he expected, even knowing her age. She had the energy of someone who had decided early and firmly that she would not be doubted. There was also, in a glass case near the elevators, a scale model of one of Vantage's flagship aircraft, a modified light jet, sleek and precise. Mason looked at it for a long time. He recognized the engine cowling design. He'd consulted on the original specifications for that cowling shape years ago, for a company that had later sold the design to a firm that had later sold it to another firm. The kind of chain that happens in aerospace where your work travels farther than you do. Nobody would know that by looking at him. He was still looking at the model when the elevator opened and Rachel Thorne stepped out. Brisk, mid-20s, tablet in hand, speaking to someone in an earpiece. She registered Mason with a glance, finished her sentence, and crossed the lobby. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming. I need to let you know there's been a slight change to the format of today's meeting." "What kind of change?" "Ms. Hart has convened a broader session. There were some developments this week that required pulling in additional stakeholders, engineering leads, investor representatives, a few board members. The original plan was a one-on-one consultation, but how many people are we talking about?" Rachel Thorne hesitated in a way that told him the number was not small. "The Whitmore Auditorium holds 400. It's about 2/3 full." Mason looked at her. He looked down at his toolbox, about a Craftsman unit he'd had for 15 years. The top tray bent slightly from an incident involving a dropped landing gear strut, his initials scratched into the side with a flathead screwdriver. He looked at the toy airplane tucked into his shirt pocket, a small die-cast model, maybe 4 inches long, that Lily used to carry everywhere and that he now kept with him the way some men keep photographs. "All right," he said. The Whitmore Auditorium was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel the weight of where they were. High ceiling, tiered seating, the kind of lighting that cast everything in a professional glow that made whoever stood at the front look important. Mason walked in through a side door and immediately understood that he had badly misjudged the situation. The room was full. Not almost full. Full the way auditoriums get when something is happening that people feel they need to witness. Engineers in lanyards and company shirts filling the lower tiers. Men and women in business attire in the upper sections, some with tablets, some with coffee, most with the alert, skeptical posture of people who were used to evaluating things quickly. At the back, a row of people who had the specific stillness of investors, watchful, contained, saying nothing. At the front of the room, at a long table on the low stage, sat Evelyn Hart. In the photograph, she'd looked controlled. In person, she was something else. There was a quality to her attention. The way her eyes tracked to Mason the moment he entered, the slight adjustment in her posture, that reminded him of certain aircraft instruments. Precise, calibrated, registering everything. She was flanked by 2 men Mason didn't recognize. Suits. Older. The kind of senior engineers who'd stopped doing hands-on work long enough ago that their expertise had become theoretical, which wasn't a criticism, just an observation. He'd known enough of them to recognize the type. On the stage, to the left of the table, a large screen displayed a schematic of one of the fleet aircraft. Data readouts. Sensor logs. The kind of output you get when a diagnostic system is talking but not quite saying anything useful. Rachel Thorne guided Mason toward the stage and then quietly disappeared. Mason walked to the front of the room alone, carrying his toolbox in one hand and his dignity in the other, and he could feel the shift in the room as he moved. The ripple of whispered assessments, the way people's postures changed from polite waiting to something sharper. He heard someone in the third row say something he couldn't make out, followed by a muffled laugh. He kept walking. Evelyn Hart stood when he reached the stage. She didn't extend her hand. "Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice carried easily in the acoustics of the room. Clear, unforced, the voice of someone who had learned to fill space without performing. "I appreciate you making the trip." "No problem," he said. She looked at the toolbox. She looked at the toy airplane in his pocket. Something moved behind her eyes, not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. The flash of an assessment made and completed in under 2 seconds. "I want to be transparent with you," she said, "and with everyone in this room. We've been working with some of the most advanced aerospace diagnostics firms in the country. We have engineers with doctoral degrees and decades of fleet experience who have been on this problem for nearly 3 months. She paused. "Someone on my team suggested we reach out to you based on some early career work you did before leaving the industry. I want to give every legitimate option a fair hearing." Before leaving the industry. Not before stepping back or before shifting focus. Before leaving. Like it had been a choice made out of weakness. "I understand," Mason said. "Do you want to explain to the room what your current role is? For context." He looked at her steadily. "I do maintenance work at Hargrove Regional Airfield. Single-engine aircraft, some light twin-engine, occasional turboprop. I've been there 4 years." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people who have just had a suspicion confirmed. "And before that?" "Before that, I was out of the industry." "For how long?" "About 2 years." Evelyn nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not actually absorbing what you're saying, but are waiting for the moment when the information becomes useful to a point they're already planning to make. "So, to summarize," she said, turning slightly toward the room as she spoke, "we have a systemic, fleet-wide technical issue that has stumped some of the most credentialed engineers in private aviation, and one proposed solution is," she gestured toward Mason, "a regional airfield mechanic who's been out of any serious aerospace environment for the better part of a decade." The laugh that moved through the auditorium wasn't loud. It was the kind of laugh that travels in waves, starting somewhere in the middle tiers, spreading sideways, a few people in the back joining late. Not malicious, exactly. The laughter of a room that had been holding a skeptical thought and had just been given permission to let it out. Mason stood there and took it. He'd taken things before. One of the senior engineers at the table, a heavy-set man with silver hair and the particular confidence of someone who's been the smartest person in most rooms for 30 years, leaned toward the microphone in front of him. "Ms. Hart, I want to be respectful here, but I do think we need to be careful about what message this sends. Our team has run 4 complete diagnostic cycles. We have data from every onboard sensor system. If the answer were findable by visual inspection and hands-on," he paused, and the word he chose next was precise. "Intuition. We would have found it weeks ago." "Dr. Prescott," Evelyn said, acknowledging him, then returning her gaze to Mason. "Do you have any questions before we begin, or any, let's say, concerns about the scope of what we're asking?" Mason looked at the schematic on the screen behind her. He looked at the data readouts. He looked at the row of engineers watching him with the particular expression of people who have already decided the outcome of a test. Then he looked at Evelyn Hart. "Can I get physical access to one of the aircraft?" he asked. A beat. "Yes," she said. "That was always part of the arrangement." "Then I don't have questions," he said. "I have work to do." Teach. They walked him to Hangar 3. It was a large group. Evelyn, Dr. Prescott, 2 other senior engineers, a handful of junior staff who seemed uncertain why they'd been included, and a small cluster of investor representatives who had apparently decided that watching this unfold in person was worth their afternoon. The walk from the auditorium to the hangar took about 4 minutes along an enclosed corridor. and nobody said much during it. Mason walked in the middle of the group, slightly apart from everyone else, carrying his toolbox. Hangar 3 housed 4 of the fleet aircraft, the ones currently grounded pending resolution of the problem. They were lined up with the particular precision of machines that cost more than most people's houses, their surfaces polished to a degree that made them look almost theoretical, like representations of aircraft rather than actual aircraft. Mason stopped just inside the hangar door and looked at them. He set his toolbox down. He took the toy airplane out of his shirt pocket and held it for a moment. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the way you handle something you've been carrying for a long time. Then he set it on top of the toolbox. "Which one has the most complete sensor log from the most recent incident?" he asked. One of the junior engineers, a young woman with a company lanyard and the expression of someone who'd been skeptical of this entire situation but was trying to be professional about it, checked her tablet. "Aircraft 7, she said. "The November 3rd event." "That one," Mason said, pointing to the second aircraft in the row without looking at his tablet because he didn't have a tablet. Dr. Prescott made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mason picked up his toolbox and walked toward Aircraft 7. He started from the outside. That surprised them. He could tell from the way the group resettled, the small adjustments in posture, the exchanged glances, that they'd expected him to go straight to the sensor data, the way their own process had begun. Logic said you started with the data. Data was specific. Data was objective. Data told you where to look. Mason had been doing this long enough to know that data told you where the system said the problem was, which was not always the same as where the problem actually was. He walked the exterior of the aircraft slowly, systematically, running his hand along surfaces with the focused attention of someone reading something in a language other people in the room didn't speak. He crouched down to look at the undercarriage. He stood on the provided platform to check the engine cowling. He opened an access panel on the fuselage belly and shone a flashlight into the cavity, not touching anything yet, just looking. "What exactly is he looking for?" one of the investors said to no one in particular, in the tone of someone who expected to be answered. "We're not entirely sure," Evelyn said quietly. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The group shifted. A couple of the investor representatives drifted toward the hangar wall and checked their phones. Dr. Prescott watched Mason with an expression that had evolved from dismissive to something else. Not quite interested, but attentive in the way a person gets when something unexpected is taking longer than they thought it would. Mason opened his toolbox and took out a vibration sensor. Not the wireless digital kind the company's engineering team had been using, but an older analog unit, the kind of instrument that had been largely replaced because it required interpretation rather than just readout. The screen on this model didn't give you a number. It gave you a waveform, and you had to understand what you were looking at. "That's, the junior engineer started. TV4 contact vibration sensor," Mason said without looking up. "Made it by hand. The commercial version had a response lag that bothered me." He pressed it against a housing on the secondary drive assembly. Not the primary system, not the obvious location, but a junction point that most inspection protocols didn't flag because it wasn't on the critical path. He held it there. He closed his eyes. The hangar was quiet enough that you could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of aircraft on the main tarmac. No one spoke. Mason's expression changed. It was a small change, a slight narrowing around the eyes, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. The kind of change you'd miss if you weren't watching closely. But Evelyn Hart was watching closely. "There," he said softly. "There what?" Dr. Prescott said immediately. Mason didn't answer. He moved the sensor 12 inches along the housing, held it, then moved it back. He did this 3 times with the precision of someone triangulating something, narrowing a location by feel and comparison rather than by instrument readout. Then he set the vibration sensor down, reached into his toolbox for a different tool, a small mirror on a flexible arm, the kind of thing you use when you need to see around a corner inside a machine, and carefully, methodically, angled it into the secondary housing junction. What he saw made him go very still. Not still the way people go still when they're surprised, still the way people go still when something they suspected turns out to be real, and the reality is worse than the suspicion. "Ms. Hart," he said, His voice was even. She would remember that later. How even his voice was when everyone else's would not have been. "Yes," she said, and she was already moving forward. "You need to ground all 12 aircraft immediately." The auditorium moment had generated skepticism. This statement generated something different. "That's—" Dr. Prescott started. "Now," Mason said. He looked up at Evelyn Hart directly. Not at Dr. Prescott, not at the room, just at her. "Not tomorrow. Not after we finish the inspection. Right now, while I explain what I found." Evelyn looked at him for 2 seconds. 3. The kind of pause that in her world represented serious deliberation. Then she turned to Rachel Thorne, who had apparently materialized from somewhere behind the investor group. "Ground the fleet," she said. "Effective immediately." "Ms. Hart," Dr. Prescott said. "All 12, she said. "Until further notice." The hangar erupted. Not loudly. The people in this room were professionals, and professionals don't often raise their voices even when the situation warrants it. But there was a sudden movement, phones coming out, quiet, urgent conversations starting at the edges of the group, the investor representatives straightening up with the particular alertness of people who have just calculated a number and don't like the result. Mason set down the mirror tool and turned back to the housing junction. He reached in carefully with a gloved hand and, working by feel inside a cavity too small and awkward for most people to navigate without discomfort, extracted a component so small that when he held it up in the hangar lighting, the junior engineer in the front of the group had to take 2 steps forward to see what she was looking at. It was a resonance-dampening clip, about the size of a thumbnail. Standard spec hardware, the kind of thing used in dozens of aviation applications, available from a dozen suppliers, inspected as part of routine maintenance protocols. This one had a hairline fracture running along its inner curve, invisible to the naked eye under normal lighting, impossible to detect from sensor data because it wasn't in a location any sensor was monitoring, not on the critical path, not flagged by any diagnostic protocol. Just there, failing quietly, generating a vibration pattern too small and too specific to register as an anomaly in any system that wasn't specifically calibrated to look for it, but large enough, consistently, cumulatively, over time, to produce false readings in 3 different sensor systems simultaneously. False readings that looked like 3 separate, unrelated problems. Mason held it up and said nothing for a moment. Then, "This is what you've been chasing for 11 weeks, he said. "Not 3 problems. 1. The vibration signature from this fracture is feeding into the sensor array and producing noise that the diagnostic system is interpreting as anomalies in the fuel management, the primary air data, and the autopilot trim." He paused. "It's going to look different in each aircraft because the fracture will have progressed to different stages. But they all started the same way, same component, same manufacturing batch, my guess. Same failure mode." The hangar was completely silent. "And you found that," Evelyn said slowly, "with a vibration sensor you built yourself." "An experience," Mason said. Dr. Prescott's face was doing something complicated. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked at the component in Mason's hand with the specific expression of a man who has spent 11 weeks looking for something and has just watched someone else find it in 40 minutes. "We'll need to verify," he said, because it was the only professional thing left to say. "Of course," Mason said. He set the clip on a clean cloth on his toolbox. "Check all 11 others. Same location, secondary housing junction on the portside drive assembly, 3rd access panel from the tail section. You're looking for the same fracture pattern." He stepped back from the aircraft and picked up the toy airplane from the top of his toolbox. He turned it over once in his hand, the way he did sometimes when he was thinking. Not a nervous habit, just a way of organizing his thoughts through his hands, the way people who work with physical things sometimes need to. In the second row of the observing group, someone's phone rang. They stepped away to answer it and came back 30 seconds later with a different expression. One of the investor representatives cleared his throat. "What exactly are we talking about in terms of timeline for repair?" "Component replacement is straightforward," Mason said. "An hour per aircraft if you have the parts. If you're ordering new ones, make sure you get them from a different batch. I'd want to see the cert documentation before anything goes back in the air." "And if we hadn't found this?" Evelyn said. Mason looked at her steadily. At the current rate of fracture propagation, he paused. You had maybe 60 to 90 flight hours before the vibration transferred load to the primary assembly housing. What happens after that depends on which system fails first, how many people are on board, and what the weather's doing. Nobody in the hangar said anything. Nobody laughed. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows of the hangar at a low angle now, catching the polished surfaces of the grounded aircraft. And Mason Cole stood in the middle of it all with his old toolbox and his small toy airplane, exactly as he'd arrived, while the room around him tried to figure out what had just happened and what it meant. Evelyn Hart looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face had changed. Not collapsed, not contrite, but shifted. Like a calculation that had been running in the background had just returned a different result than expected. She didn't say anything yet. She would have things to say, but not yet. Mason reached down and unsnapped his toolbox closed. You should start on aircraft 8 next, he said. The sensor log from November 3rd shows the earliest anomaly signature in that one. It's probably furthest along. He picked up the toolbox, tucked the toy airplane back in his shirt pocket, and walked toward aircraft 8 without being asked. Behind him, he heard Dr. Prescott say something quietly to one of his colleagues. He didn't catch all of it, but he heard the word impossible. And this time, nobody laughed. Nobody moved for almost a full minute after Mason walked away toward aircraft 8. That was the thing nobody would talk about later. Not the discovery, not the component, not even the grounding order, but that specific moment when a room full of credentialed, experienced, professionally skeptical people just stood there in a hangar and watched a man in a flannel shirt walk away from them, and not one of them said a word. Dr. Prescott had his arms crossed. Two of the junior engineers were looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have just witnessed something they haven't yet decided how to classify. The investor representatives were on their phones, but quietly, heads down, the way people get when they're delivering news they don't fully understand yet but know is significant. Evelyn Hart stood exactly where she'd been standing when Mason said you should start on aircraft 8 next, and she was doing what she did when she was processing something difficult. She was absolutely still. Not relaxed still. The other kind. Rachel Thorne appeared at her elbow. That was Rachel's particular talent, appearing at the right moment without being summoned. The grounding notification is going out to all operators now, Rachel said quietly. We're going to get calls. I know. The Meridian contract alone. I know, Rachel. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Do you want me to have someone stay with him while he works? Evelyn looked across the hangar to where Mason had set his toolbox down in front of aircraft 8 and was already moving through his opening inspection sequence. Exterior first, same as before, slow and methodical, not looking at anyone. Yes, she said. Send Jamie, and tell her to actually pay attention. Jamie was the junior engineer who told Mason which aircraft had the most complete sensor log. Her name was Jamie Okafor. She was 26, and she had spent the last 11 weeks writing diagnostic reports that had apparently been looking in entirely the wrong place. She was not having an easy afternoon. She walked across the hangar to where Mason was working with the expression of someone approaching a situation they've decided to treat as a learning experience, mainly because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with. Ms. Hart asked me to assist you, she said. Mason glanced at her briefly. You're the one who knew the sensor log. Yes. Good. You know the aircraft then. He handed her a flashlight without ceremony. Hold this. Angle it about 30 degrees into the panel when I open it, not straight in. Straight in creates glare off the housing. Jamie took the flashlight. Okay, she said. That was how it started between them. She held the flashlight. He opened the third access panel from the tail section on aircraft 8's port side, and within 4 minutes of beginning the inspection, 4 minutes, using the same homemade vibration sensor, the same patient process, he located the fracture on the second aircraft. It was further progressed than the one on aircraft 7. The hairline crack had spread laterally along nearly 40% of the clip's inner curve. There it is, he said. Jamie looked at the sensor readout, then at the angle of his tool, then at the location he was indicating inside the housing junction. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the honesty of someone too tired to be defensive, We ran 3 diagnostic cycles on this aircraft. We didn't flag that junction once. It's not on the standard protocol, Mason said. The secondary housing junction in this drive assembly design was added in the Gen 3 upgrade, but the inspection protocol template was carried over from the Gen 2 framework. Nobody updated it. Jamie stared at him. How do you know which generation template we're using? Mason was already carefully extracting the component. Because I helped write the Gen 2 framework, he said, 14 years ago, and I know where the gaps are. He said it the same way he said everything, without emphasis, without drama, like it was just information being exchanged. But Jamie Okafor went very still in the same way Evelyn Hart had gone still earlier, and she looked at the side of Mason Cole's face while he worked with an expression that was visibly recalibrating something. You worked on the Gen 2 inspection protocols, she said. Consulting basis. I was with Harman Avionics at the time. They had the framework contract. Harman Avionics was acquired by... She stopped. She ran the chain in her head. They were acquired by Prescott Aerospace Solutions in 2015. Mason looked up from his work. That's right. Jamie looked across the hangar to where Dr. Prescott was now on his phone, pacing slowly near the hangar door. Dr. Gerald Prescott. Prescott. Aerospace Solutions. She did the math quietly, and then closed her mouth and didn't say the thing she was thinking. Mason watched her not say it. Not his fault, he said simply. He inherited the protocols same as everyone else. Nobody thinks to audit the things that have always been there. He set the second fractured component on the cloth next to the first and looked at them side by side. The second was visibly worse. You could see the progression even without magnification if you knew what you were looking at. Jamie leaned in close and studied them both. At this rate of progression, she said slowly, if this one failed first, primary assembly takes the load transfer, yes. Over a populated area. Most of the vantage routes are overpopulated areas. She straightened up. She looked at him directly, and there was something in her face that went past professional respect into something more personal. The recognition that the thing she spent her days preventing had been much closer than she'd understood this morning. How did you know where to look? She asked. I mean, really, we had all the sensor data. We had the full diagnostic history. You walked in and found it in under an hour. Mason thought about how to answer that. He didn't rush it. The data told you where the symptoms were, he said finally. 3 separate anomalies in 3 separate systems. That looks like 3 problems. But 3 problems don't develop simultaneously across a whole fleet on the same timeline unless they have one cause. He picked up the vibration sensor. The software is looking for the answer it was programmed to find. I was looking for something different. What were you looking for? He turned the sensor over in his hand. Something that doesn't belong, he said. A pattern that the system isn't designed to recognize because nobody thought to look for it there. Jamie was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds like something you learn, not something you read. Both, Mason said. He put the sensor back in the toolbox. But mostly learn. He moved toward Aircraft 9. She followed him with the flashlight. They didn't talk much for the next hour. Mason worked and Jamie assisted and paid attention the way Evelyn had told her to, and what she was paying attention to wasn't just the technical process. It was the approach. The way Mason moved through an aircraft wasn't random, and it wasn't exactly by protocol either. It was something in between. The protocol as a skeleton, with years of intuition filling in the spaces between the bones. He touched things before he looked at them. He listened. Twice he stopped and tilted his head slightly, the way you do when you're hearing something at the edge of your range, and both times he then moved to a specific location and found something worth noting, even if it wasn't the primary fracture issue. On Aircraft 9, he found the fracture in under 3 minutes. The crack was smaller, so earlier stage, less propagation, but it was there. Same spot, Jamie said, not really needing to say it. Same spot, Mason confirmed. She photographed everything and entered it into her tablet as they went. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, she stopped thinking of herself as someone who'd been assigned to monitor him and started thinking of herself as someone who was working with him. The distinction mattered, though she couldn't articulate why. At the other end of the hangar, a different kind of work was happening. Dr. Prescott had reassembled a small team around the first component Mason had extracted. 3 senior engineers, 2 of them specialists in mechanical failure analysis, One of them a metallurgist who'd apparently been called in from another building. They had proper magnification equipment now, articulated lighting, the kind of setup that turned a small object into a landscape you could map. Mason was halfway through his inspection of Aircraft 9 when one of the engineers from that group crossed the hangar toward him. A man named Reyes, whom Mason hadn't met, carrying a tablet with photographs on it, and the expression of someone delivering a verdict they hadn't expected to reach. "The fracture pattern is consistent across both components," Reyes said without preamble. "Metallurgy confirms it's a stress fracture from a microvoid in the alloy composition, not from installation or mechanical impact. It's a manufacturing defect, which means it's in every component from that production batch," Mason said. "We think so. We're pulling the batch documentation now." Reyes paused. He looked at Mason with the directness of an engineer who evaluates things on their merits. "Dr. Prescott would like to speak with you when you have a moment. I'll come when I've finished the aircraft in this hangar," Mason said. Reyes nodded and left without arguing, which told Mason something about how the temperature of the room had changed. He went back to Aircraft 9. There was a moment, while he was deep in the access panel with his mirror tool, and Jamie was holding the light at the angle he'd shown her, that she asked, quietly, not making a production of it, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," he said, not looking up. "Why did you leave? The industry, I mean. You clearly—" She stopped. "You know things that people with your level of knowledge don't usually step away from." Mason was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My wife got sick," he said. Jamie said nothing. "It happened fast, faster than, yeah. It was fast." He found the fracture on Aircraft 9 and marked the location. "After she passed, I had a 6-year-old and no family in the area, and a job that required 70% travel, so I made a choice." "I'm sorry," Jamie said. And she meant it, but more than that, she said it simply, without dressing it up, which was the right way to say it, and not everyone knew that. "The job at Hargrove came up," Mason said. "Regional airfield, 8 miles from the house. Lily's school is on the way. It's not what I used to do, but I could be home by 5:30. He extracted the third fractured component and placed it on the cloth. "You make the trade you need to make." Jamie looked at the toy airplane visible in his shirt pocket. She'd noticed it earlier and hadn't asked. She didn't ask now either. "Lily's your daughter?" "Yeah." "How old?" 6, 7 in March. "Does she know you're here?" "She thinks I'm at work," he said. Which is accurate. He said it without irony, but there was something in it anyway. Some quiet acknowledgement of the gap between what today was and what most of his days were. Jamie caught it and didn't pursue it. They moved to Aircraft 10. By the time they'd finished Aircraft 10, another fracture, slightly different progression, same location, the light outside the hangar windows had shifted into late afternoon. Someone had brought coffee at some point and left it on a rolling equipment cart without explanation. Mason poured a cup and drank half of it and set the rest aside. Jamie finished hers completely. 11 weeks, she said, not accusing, just stating it. "I know. We had some really sharp people on this." "I believe that," Mason said, and he did. He hadn't seen anything in their work that suggested carelessness or incompetence. He'd seen people using the right tools for the wrong problem, which was a completely different failure mode. "The Gen 2 protocol gap," Jamie said. "If we'd updated the template when the Gen 3 upgrade came out..." "Maybe," Mason said. "Maybe not. The secondary housing junction isn't intuitive as an inspection point, even if it's on your list. You have to know what you're feeling for. You'd have to teach people." "Yes." She looked at him over her coffee. "Would you?" He looked back at her. It was a genuine question, and he treated it as one. "I don't know what I'm doing after today," he said honestly. "Depends on a lot of things." That was where that conversation ended, because Rachel Thorne appeared in the hangar door and said that Evelyn Hart would like a status update, and Mason said he'd come to her when the last aircraft in this hangar was done. And Rachel relayed that to whoever was on her earpiece, and 2 minutes later Evelyn herself appeared at the hangar door. She walked across the floor alone, which was notable. She'd arrived with an entourage earlier and left with one. Now she crossed the hangar by herself, with her hands in the pockets of her jacket, and stopped a few feet from where Mason was beginning the inspection of Aircraft 11. "3 down," she said. 4. Including aircraft 7. Right. She looked at the row of components on the cloth. 4 fractured clips in a line. And the others are in the second hangar. 8 more aircraft. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to ask you something. Okay. And I want you to answer me honestly, not the way you'd answer if you were trying to be professional about it. He looked at her. When you walked into that auditorium this morning, she said, and I said what I said, the way I framed it. She didn't look away from him. Were you angry? Mason considered the question. He took it seriously, which he hadn't expected. Not angry exactly, he said. It wasn't the first time. That's not the same as it being acceptable. No, he agreed. It's not. A pause. I made a calculation this morning, she said. I have a room full of investors who are already nervous about the grounding situation, a board that second-guesses every unorthodox decision, and someone walks in with a toolbox that looks older than my career. I made a calculation about perception. Her jaw was tight. I made the wrong calculation. You didn't know who I was, Mason said. I didn't ask. That landed in the air between them. She'd meant it as a self-criticism, and it was, and they both knew it. Mason turned back to the aircraft. The component that failed, he said, isn't on any protocol checklist. Wasn't on the Gen 2, isn't on what you're using now. The inspection gap exists because when the Gen 3 airframe upgrade was designed, someone, and it wasn't anyone in this room, made a decision about cost and timeline that meant the inspection documentation didn't get a full review. The fracture is a manufacturing defect in a batch that probably shipped to 6 or 7 other operators in addition to Vantage. You should contact the FAA and the manufacturer simultaneously. Evelyn was very still again. How many other operators? I don't know the exact number, but anyone who took delivery of aircraft from this generation during a roughly 18-month window is at risk. If the batch documentation shows what I think it'll show. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone. I need to make calls. I know, Mason said. You should. But she started to turn away and then stopped. The toy airplane, she said. In your pocket. He looked at her. You've been carrying it all day. I noticed it this morning in the auditorium and She stopped. I thought it was strange. I used it as part of the impression I was building. I figured, he said. What is it? He took it out and held it on his palm for a moment. It was a small die-cast model, the kind of thing you find in toy shops near airports, chrome-finished, not particularly detailed, the paint worn on the nose from being handled so many times. My wife gave it to Lily when she was about 2, he said. Lily carried it everywhere, dropped it once, and bent the landing gear. He turned it over. The gear was straight now. I fixed it. Took me 3 hours. The parts are smaller than they look. He put it back in his pocket. After Sarah died, Lily stopped carrying it, left it on the kitchen counter. I started taking it to work so she wouldn't lose it. Became a habit. Evelyn looked at his pocket where the airplane had disappeared. Something moved in her expression. Not pity, because he hadn't offered it for pity, but recognition. The kind you can't manufacture. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, turned, and walked back across the hangar, already raising her phone to her ear. Mason went back to work. The next 3 hours were, in their way, the quietest part of the day. Not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening had found its shape. Mason moved through the remaining aircraft with Jamie one step behind him, and the inspection settling into a rhythm that felt almost companionable. They found the fracture on 11. They found it on 12. Different stages, same defect, same location, same root cause. 8 aircraft, 8 fractured components. A full fleet grounded with good reason. In the background, the organizational response was gathering speed. Reyes and his team were deep in the batch documentation now, building a paper trail that was going to extend well beyond Vantage's fleet. Rachel Thorne was fielding calls from operators and from the FAA. Dr. Prescott had gone quiet in a way that wasn't sulking. It was the specific quiet of an engineer who has reconfigured his understanding of a problem and is now working with the corrected version as fast as he can. At some point, Mason became aware that the investor representatives had left. He didn't know when. He also became aware that 2 additional engineers he hadn't met had joined Jamie's end of the operation, and that they were working from his notes, which Jamie had apparently been taking more thoroughly than he'd realized, to build an updated inspection protocol in real time. "You don't have to do that tonight," he told them when he realized what they were doing. One of them, a stocky man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, shrugged. "Better tonight than a week from now," he said. Mason looked at Jamie. "That's Marcus," she said. "He wrote most of the current protocol templates. He's been quietly furious about the Gen 3 documentation gap for 2 years, but couldn't prove there was a problem." Marcus did not disagree with this characterization. "I flagged it in a review memo in 2022, he said without looking up from his screen. Dr. Prescott's office said the Gen 2 framework had adequate coverage. A pause. It didn't. Mason said nothing to that. There were political histories in every organization that were not his to navigate. By 7:15 in the evening, all 12 aircraft had been inspected. All 12 fractured components were laid out on the cloth in a row. Mason had asked that they be arranged in order of fracture progression, from least to most advanced, and they had been. Standing there looking at them was a thing people did for a while when they came into the hangar. Nobody asked Mason to arrange them. He'd done it because it told a story that words took longer to tell. That this was a progression, a timeline, a disaster building in stages across a fleet of aircraft that had been carrying passengers through the air for 11 months since the first fracture had begun to develop. The last person to look at them for a long time, alone, was Dr. Prescott. Mason had finished packing his toolbox when the older man walked over and stood beside him without introduction. They stood there looking at the 12 components in a row, and after a moment Prescott said, without turning his head, "The Gen 2 protocol." "Yes," Mason said. "You wrote the secondary housing junction specification into the Gen 2 framework. I recommended it. The team decided not to include it. Secondary systems, non-critical path. It added time and the timeline was tight." He paused. "I should have pushed harder." Prescott looked at him then. "That was 14 years ago." "A thing being old doesn't make it not your fault," Mason said. Prescott was quiet. Then, "No, I suppose not." He looked back at the components. "For what it's worth, the memo Marcus sent in 2022. My office responded to it. I never saw it. I don't know what that says about my office or about me, but I never saw it." "I believe you," Mason said. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Mason said. "It's just true." Prescott picked up his jacket from the equipment cart where he'd laid it hours earlier. He looked old in a way he hadn't looked that morning. Not in a physical sense, but the way people look when a day has cost them something they hadn't budgeted for. "You know," he said, "when Hart's assistant called to set up today's session, I told her this was a waste of everyone's time, that we'd already exhausted the diagnostic options and what we needed was to be looking at software issues in the sensor array, not—" He stopped. "I had a lot of things to say this morning." "You weren't wrong about your diagnostic work," Mason said. "You just didn't have the right starting point." Prescott put on his jacket. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," Mason said. "Wrong tools for the wrong problem isn't incompetence. It's a gap in the framework. We all work inside frameworks." Prescott looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite respect and was probably both with something more complicated underneath. Then he nodded once and walked toward the hangar door. Mason latched his toolbox. The hangar was quieter now. Jamie was across the room finishing entries on her tablet, the rest of the team filtering out. The 12 grounded aircraft sat in their stalls with the particular stillness of machines that know they're not going anywhere tonight. Somewhere outside, Mason could hear it faintly. The tarmac was active, other aircraft moving on the main field, the world of aviation continuing on its ordinary schedule, unaware of what had almost started going wrong inside this hangar months ago. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the exit, and he was nearly at the door when he realized he'd left the toy airplane sitting on top of the equipment cart where he'd put it when he started the last inspection. He went back for it. He always went back for it. He tucked it into his shirt pocket and stood there for a second in the middle of the empty hangar, and he thought about Lily at home, about the after-school program and what she'd had for dinner, and whether she'd remembered to feed Gerald the stuffed rabbit in whatever game they played together that involved stuffed animals needing meals. He thought about the drive home, 4 hours, and that he'd need coffee for the second half of it, and that the truck's transmission was still making that sound, and that he'd have to deal with that soon, probably this weekend if he could find the time. He thought about the 12 components in a row on the cloth, and the 60 to 90 hours that hadn't happened, and the passengers who hadn't been on those flights yet. He didn't think about any of it for too long. He was tired in the particular way you get tired when you've been holding something steady for a long time. Not exhausted, just emptied out and ready to stop. He walked out of the hangar into the evening air, and the parking lot lights were coming on in the early dark, and his truck was where he'd left it at the far end of the visitor lot, and it looked exactly the same as it always looked. A little worse for the miles, a little better for the fact that it still ran. He drove to the gate, stopped at the security booth, and handed back his visitor badge to a young man who was barely paying attention and said, "Have a good night, sir," in the automatic way people say things at the end of shifts. "You too," Mason said. He pulled out of the Vantage Aerospace parking lot and pointed the truck toward home, and behind him the lights of the complex receded in the rearview mirror, and somewhere inside that building, 12 aircraft sat grounded and intact and still carrying all the people they hadn't yet hurt. And Mason Cole drove north in the dark and thought about nothing much except the road. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him 40 minutes later. He glanced at it at a red light. Unknown number. Area code he didn't recognize. He thought about not answering. He answered. "Mr. Cole," Evelyn Hart's voice. "I'm sorry to call in the evening." "It's fine," he said. The light turned green. He drove. "I wanted to reach you before tomorrow because there are some things I want to say, and I didn't want to leave them unsaid overnight." A pause. Not a rhetorical pause. An actual one. "What I said in the auditorium this morning, the way I introduced you, the way I framed your background, Ms. Hart." "Let me finish," she said. "Please." He let her finish. "It wasn't just an error in judgment," she said. "It was a choice. I knew the room was going to react the way it reacted. I've been running that room long enough to know exactly what I was doing." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that cost her. "That's worse than a mistake. I want you to know that I understand that." Mason drove for a moment without speaking. "Okay," he said. "Is that—" She stopped. "That's all you're going to say?" "What would you like me to say?" A long pause. "I don't know, something angrier maybe." He almost smiled. "I've got a 4-hour drive and a 6-year-old waiting at the other end of it," he said. "I don't have the energy for angry." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "We'll need to discuss next steps regarding the fleet. The manufacturer contact, the FAA notification, the inspection protocol update. There's going to be a process here that's going to require—" "I know," he said. "Would you be willing to come back?" He watched the highway unroll in his headlights. The truck made its sound from somewhere in the transmission. The toy airplane was in his shirt pocket, and he could feel it there the way you feel things you've carried long enough. "Call me tomorrow," he said. "After 9. My daughter has a thing at school at 8:30. Another pause, shorter this time. "After 9, Evelyn said. "I'll call at 9:15. "That works," he said. They hung up. He drove. 3 hours and 40 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of his apartment building and sat in the truck for a minute after he turned off the engine, the way he did sometimes when the transition from one version of the day to the next needed a moment to happen properly. The lot was quiet. Upstairs in apartment 4C, Mrs. Delaney from next door would be watching television with the volume too high, and Lily would be asleep in her room with Gerald the rabbit and the baby monitor transmitting the sound of her breathing to a receiver sitting on the kitchen counter because Mason had moved it there from the nightstand 2 weeks ago and hadn't moved it back yet. He went upstairs. He checked on Lily first, the way he always did. She was asleep on her side. Same angle of jaw, same relaxed brow. The stuffed rabbit was somewhere under the covers, its ear visible near the pillow. On the nightstand, Mrs. Delaney had left a note. "She ate all her dinner, did homework, asked where Daddy was, I said, at work. Bedtime 8:30, no fuss. Gerald needed a bath apparently. He's damp." Mason looked at his daughter for a long time in the dark. Then he went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window above the sink that looked out over the parking lot. He took the toy airplane out of his shirt pocket and set it on the windowsill, where the ambient light from outside caught it just enough to see the worn chrome nose and the landing gear he'd spent 3 hours straightening years ago. He drank his water. He thought about 11 weeks and 12 aircraft and what 60 flight hours looks like on a calendar. He thought about a fracture the size of a thumbnail. He thought about the way the room had gone quiet, not the theatrical quiet of an auditorium that has stopped laughing, but the real quiet that follows when people understand they've been close to something and didn't know it. He rinsed the glass and set it in the drain rack and turned off the kitchen light. He was asleep before 10. Evelyn called at 9:14. Mason was still in the school parking lot when his phone rang, watching Lily's backpack disappear through the double doors of Riverside Elementary, with the particular focus of a parent who has learned that watching until the door closes completely is not optional. Some mornings, Lily turned around at the door and waved. This morning, she didn't. She was deep in conversation with a girl named Priya, who was apparently the current axis around which Lily's social universe rotated. And Mason sat with his phone buzzing on the passenger seat and waited until the door shut behind them before he picked up. "You're 1 minute early," he said. A brief pause. "I've been awake since 4:30, Evelyn said. 1 minute felt like a reasonable compromise. He pulled out of the school lot and merged onto the main road. "What happened overnight?" "A significant amount," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been managing information for hours and is now at the stage where they need to hand some of it off. "The batch documentation came through at 2 a.m. The fractured components in our fleet trace back to a production run completed by Dalton Precision Manufacturing 18 months ago. The same batch shipped to 9 other operators." 9, Mason. He hadn't told her she could call him Mason. She'd done it anyway, somewhere between the late-night phone call and the morning, and he'd noticed but didn't see a reason to correct it. "How many aircraft total?" he asked. "We're still compiling, at least 40, possibly more. Some of the smaller charter operations don't have centralized fleet management systems, and tracking their delivery records is taking time." She paused. "The FAA contact went out last night. I spoke personally with the regional director at 11 p.m. There's going to be an emergency airworthiness directive. They want our full documentation package by end of business today, and they want you on a call at 2 o'clock. "Me specifically?" The regional director asked who identified the failure mode. When I told him, he asked if you were available. Mason drove for a moment. Outside, the morning was gray and flat. One of those November days that doesn't bother making an impression. He thought about his shift at Hargrove, which started at 8 and which he'd already called in about, leaving a message for his supervisor that was vague in the way messages are when you're not sure how to explain the situation you're in. "I can do 2 o'clock, he said. "There's one other thing." Evelyn's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful. The board convened an emergency session at 7 this morning, virtual. All 12 members. A beat. They want a full incident briefing, in person, tomorrow. Advantage? Yes, and they want you there. Mason was quiet. "I know that's 2 days in a row," Evelyn said. "I know you have logistics, childcare, and I'll figure it out," he said. "Send me what time?" She sent it before he'd finished the sentence. 9:15 a.m., the message said. Whitmore Auditorium, which was the same room they'd started in yesterday, which Mason found either fitting or ironic and couldn't decide which. He called Mrs. Delaney when he got off the phone with Evelyn. Mrs. Delaney was 71, a retired librarian, and had been his next-door neighbor for 3 years. She watched Lily on the irregular occasions when Mason's work ran long or his truck needed shop time he couldn't schedule around. She charged him nothing and refused every attempt he'd made to change that, citing a philosophy he'd come to understand was non-negotiable. "I don't take money for time I enjoy spending." She answered on the second ring. "Is this the famous aviation hero I've been hearing about?" Mason pulled into a gas station and put the truck in park. "What?" "It's on the news, sweetheart. Well, not your name, but Vantage Aerospace grounding their whole fleet, FAA involvement. They're saying a safety issue was discovered by an independent specialist." She said specialist with a specific emphasis that meant she'd already drawn her own conclusions. That wouldn't be a certain regional airfield mechanic I know, would it? He looked at the gas station window. There was a television mounted above the coffee station inside, and even from the parking lot he could see the Vantage Aerospace logo on the screen. Don't tell Lily anything, he said. Obviously, Mrs. Delaney said. What time do you need me tomorrow? 7:30 if you can. I'll bring muffins, she said, and hung up. He sat in the gas station parking lot for a few minutes and looked at the television through the window. He couldn't hear it from here, but he could see the chyron at the bottom of the screen cycling through updates. The Vantage logo. An aerial of the headquarters complex. A file photo of Evelyn Hart, the same kind of controlled, direct expression as the lobby portrait. He watched it for a while without getting out of the truck. Then he drove to Hargrove. His supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Hutchins, who'd been running the maintenance operation at Hargrove Regional for 19 years, was waiting for him in the parking lot. Not in the way people wait when they're angry. In the way they wait when they've been watching the news and have questions they're not sure how to ask. The Vantage thing, Dale said. Yeah, that's you. They called me in as a consultant. I found something. Dale looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating what he thought he understood about someone he'd worked alongside for 4 years. How long have you known about this kind of thing? Whatever it was, It's a long story, Mason said. I need to take tomorrow off too. I'm sorry for the short notice. Dale waved it off. Take what you need. We'll cover. He paused. Mason. Yeah. The news is saying 40-plus aircraft from 9 other operators. At least 40, Mason said. Maybe more. Dale was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the tarmac where a single-engine Cessna was taxiing toward the fuel station. You saved some people, he said. Not dramatically, just factually, the way mechanics say things. Not yet, Mason said. The directive hasn't gone out. The other operators don't know yet. But they will. Today, Mason said. Yeah. He went inside and got to work. He spent the morning doing what he always did. Maintenance checks on 2 light aircraft that had come in for scheduled service. A carburetor adjustment on a Piper that had been running rough. Paperwork that he'd been putting off for a week. His hands did the familiar work and his mind ran parallel to it, processing the overnight information in pieces. 9 operators, 40 aircraft. A batch of components that had been in the air for 18 months, slowly fracturing, producing false readings, being logged as sensor anomalies and software glitches and maintenance mysteries by teams who had no reason to look where the problem actually was. He thought about a specific number, 60 to 90 flight hours. He'd set it standing in Hangar 3 yesterday afternoon. He'd said it evenly, the way he said most things, and he'd watched Evelyn go still when she heard it. He hadn't said it for effect. It was just what the numbers said. What the numbers also said, and what he hadn't spelled out, because the room was already quiet enough, was that several of those 40-plus aircraft had been in the air for long enough that some of them were close to that threshold. Some of them might already be past it. The failure mode wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a transfer of load from the compromised clip to the primary assembly housing. A progressive failure that might manifest as unusual handling characteristics before it became something worse. A pilot who knew what to feel for might catch it. A pilot who didn't might not understand what was happening until it was past the point of correction. He knew all of this, and he did his carburetor adjustment, and he filed his paperwork, and he ate his lunch. A sandwich from the vending machine in the break room, the same turkey and Swiss he got when he forgot to pack. And at 1:55 he went to his truck and called into the FAA meeting from his cell phone. The regional director's name was Bernard Chalk. He had the voice of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions in situations where the decisions mattered, and he used it the way such men often do. Economically, without warmth, but not without intelligence. Mr. Cole, he said, we've been reviewing the documentation package from Vantage. Before we issue the airworthiness directive, I want to walk through the failure mode with you directly. There are some questions the technical team has about the vibration propagation timeline. Okay, Mason said. What followed was 40 minutes that Mason would later describe to no one, because there was no one in his life at that moment who would have understood what the conversation contained. not in the technical sense. Chalk's engineering team was good. They'd been working from the photographs and the component analysis and the batch documentation for 12 hours, and they'd built a picture that was mostly right, but had one significant gap in it. They were modeling the vibration propagation as a linear progression, and it wasn't linear. It accelerated. The fracture pattern Mason had seen across the 12 Vantage aircraft showed a clear acceleration curve, slow development in the early stages, then a period of rapid propagation that corresponded to a thermal cycling threshold. An aircraft that had been flying in cold weather conditions and then warming on the ground, repeatedly, over months. Mason explained this. He explained it clearly and without jargon where he could avoid it, and where he couldn't avoid it, he defined his terms. Chalk's team asked follow-up questions. One of them, a woman named Dr. Ferris, who had a way of asking questions that told you she already knew the answer and was checking whether you did, pushed back on his acceleration model, and he responded to the pushback, and they went back and forth for about 6 minutes and arrived at the same conclusion by slightly different paths, which satisfied both of them. The acceleration curve changes the urgency profile significantly, Chalk said. Yes, Mason said. Aircraft that have been operating in northern corridors, multiple daily cycles, are furthest along the progression, yes. A brief silence. We're going to move the directive to emergency status, same-day grounding. Another pause. This is going to cause significant operational disruption. I understand, Mason said. You understand that some of these operators are going to push back on the timeline. I understand that too. And your assessment of the risk doesn't change based on the operational disruption. Mason looked out his truck window at the Hargrove tarmac. A Cessna was coming in on final approach, small and clean against the gray sky. No, he said, it doesn't. Then that's the assessment we're working from, Chalk said. We'll want a formal written statement from you. Rachel Thorne at Vantage has your contact details? She does. You'll hear from us by end of day. Chalk paused in a way that wasn't his usual economy of speech. Mr. Cole, good work. He hung up. Mason sat in the truck for a moment. Then he went back inside and finished the rest of his shift. The emergency airworthiness directive went out at 5:47 p.m. He saw it on his phone while he was picking Lily up from after school. The notification came through an aviation industry service he'd been subscribed to for years, the same service he'd checked every morning when he was at Harmon Avionics, out of habit, out of the professional reflex of needing to know what was happening in the industry he worked in. He'd kept the subscription after leaving, not really knowing why. Habit was like that. The notification read, Emergency Airworthiness Directive, all operators, resonance dampening component failure, immediate grounding required. Lily came running out of the after-school room with a drawing she'd made that appeared to be either a horse or a very confident dog. She held it up for inspection before they'd even reached the parking lot. It's a Palomino, she announced. Priya has a book about horses, and I borrowed it. It's a very good Palomino, Mason said. Its name is Captain, she said. He's mine, but I can't bring him home because Mrs. Delaney is allergic. Mrs. Delaney is allergic to horses? To his hay, Lily said, with the certainty of a child who has thought about this and found a satisfying resolution. He buckled her into the back seat and got behind the wheel and looked at the directive notification on his phone one more time. 43 aircraft across 9 operators, effective immediately. He put the phone face down on the seat. Daddy, Lily said. Yeah, Bug. Where did you go yesterday? Mrs. Delaney said you were at work, but you came home really late. I was, he said. Special job, far away. What kind of job? Fixing airplanes. He started the truck. Did you fix them? He pulled out of the parking lot. Yeah, he said. I think so. Good, she said, with the simple confidence of a child who expects her father to be good at things. She went back to examining the Palomino drawing. He drove home. That night, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and read through everything that had been published since the grounding directive went out. There was more than he expected. Aviation trade publications, general news outlets, a couple of business sites focused on the operational disruption. The angle most of the general coverage was taking, because grounding 43 aircraft across 9 operators was a logistical and financial story as much as a safety story, and that was the version that translated for non-specialist readers. None of the coverage named him. Evelyn had apparently kept his identity out of the initial statement. He was an independent specialist retained by Vantage Aerospace, which was accurate as far as it went. He was glad for that. He didn't particularly want his name attached to this in the way that public attention attaches to things. One article quoted an unnamed industry source describing the failure mode as a diagnostic blind spot that had persisted across multiple inspection cycles due to a protocol framework that predated the current airframe generation, which was also accurate, which was also the kind of careful neutral language that meant someone with legal training had reviewed the quote before it went out. He read through the technical coverage more carefully. Dr. Ferris from Chalk's team had already published a preliminary technical summary through the FAA's notification system. It was good work, thorough, correctly framed, and it cited the acceleration curve he'd described on the call, which meant she'd moved fast. He respected that. He closed the laptop and looked at the toy airplane on the windowsill. He'd left it there that morning without thinking about it. Just set it down when he made his coffee and walked away from it. It was still there now in the kitchen window, catching the streetlight from outside in its worn chrome surface. He looked at it for a while. He thought about Sarah. Not the way he used to think about her in the first year, which was a specific kind of thinking that felt like walking into a room and finding the floor was gone. Just, she would have known what today was. She would have come home from her shift at the pediatric clinic and found him at this table with the laptop, and she would have made tea without asking if he wanted any and set it down next to him and looked over his shoulder at the screen. And she would have understood immediately what she was looking at because she was that kind of person. The kind who followed what you were doing because you were doing it, not because she needed an explanation first. He missed that more than most things, being known without having to explain. He went to bed. The next morning he dropped Lily at school and drove to Vantage. He arrived at 8:40, which gave him time before the board meeting to check in with Rachel and review what had come in overnight. The lobby looked different than it had 2 days ago, quieter in a way that wasn't about the number of people in it, but about the texture of the activity. The receptionist who had looked at his truck gave him his visitor badge without any particular expression. People in the corridor he passed on the way to the conference area nodded at him, which they hadn't done before. Rachel Thorne met him outside the Whitmore Auditorium with coffee and a tablet showing the current status of the 9 other operators. 38 of the 43 aircraft have been confirmed grounded as of 7 a.m., she said. 3 operators are still working through their logistics. 2 aircraft are currently in transit. They diverted to the nearest capable airports when the directive came through. Those are being inspected now. She paused. 1 operator, Carver Executive Charter out of Colorado, is pushing back. On the grounding? On the timeline. They have 3 aircraft and 2 high-profile clients scheduled for today. They've engaged legal counsel and are arguing that the directive doesn't... She stopped. They're making a business argument. What does the FAA say? Director Chalk's office issued a follow-up notice 2 hours ago reinforcing the mandatory nature of the directive. Carver's attorney is requesting an emergency administrative review. Mason drank his coffee. The fracture on their aircraft, he said. Do we know where they are in the progression? That's part of the problem. Carver hasn't shared their batch documentation yet. We don't know which production run their components came from. Then they're flying blind on where they are in the failure timeline. Yes, Rachel said. Exactly. He handed back the coffee cup. Then the answer for Carver is no. That's Director Chalk's position as well. He's been firm. She paused. He's also asked whether you'd be willing to join a brief call with Carver's technical team this afternoon, after the board meeting, to explain the failure mode directly. Sure, Mason said. She looked at him for a moment. You've said yes to everything we've asked since yesterday morning, she said. You know you could say no. I know, he said. She seemed to want to say something else and then decided not to. She opened the auditorium door. The board meeting was different from the investor session 2 days ago in almost every way. 12 people instead of 400. A conference room setup rather than theater seating. The board members arranged around the long central table, with Evelyn at the head and Mason placed to her right, which was a deliberate positioning, and everyone in the room understood it as such. The board of Vantage Aerospace was a specific collection of people. 6 of them had aviation backgrounds. 2 former airline executives, an FAA veteran, a retired military pilot, a woman who'd spent her career in aircraft manufacturing, and Dr. Prescott, who was both a board member and the head of their engineering practice. The other 6 were business and finance people, the kind who understood aviation the way any intelligent generalist understands an industry they're invested in. Well enough to ask the right questions, not well enough to answer them. Evelyn opened the meeting without ceremony. She was precise and unsentimental in the way she'd clearly learned to be in rooms like this, presenting information, not managing emotions. She walked through the timeline, the discovery, the FAA directive, the 43 aircraft, the 9 operators. She used language that was clear and unprotected by the kind of corporate softening that makes bad news sound like a strategy pivot. She said we missed this, and our protocol framework had a critical gap, and the independent consultant we brought in identified the failure mode in less than an hour. She did not soften any of it. Then she turned to Mason. He'd been in boardrooms before, though not recently. The dynamic was familiar. The compressed attention, the way every question was also a test, the specific way board members who don't trust each other's intelligence try to establish their own by the quality of what they ask. He'd never been good at playing those games, and he wasn't going to start. He explained the failure mode. He explained the protocol gap. He explained the acceleration curve and why aircraft operating in northern corridor cold weather cycles were furthest advanced in the progression. He explained why the existing diagnostic software had been interpreting the vibration signature as 3 separate problems rather than 1. He explained it clearly, without condescension and without performance, and the 6 aviation people at the table tracked every word with the focused stillness of people who understand stakes, and the 6 business people tracked it with the focused stillness of people who are calculating what it means. When he finished, the silence lasted about 4 seconds, long for a boardroom. Then a man named Harrington, who was the board's audit chair and who had the permanently skeptical expression of someone whose job is to find problems, said, "Mr. Cole, the component failure, manufacturing defect in the Dalton batch. Do we have grounds for liability claim?" Mason looked at him. "That's a legal question." "Informed by a technical opinion," Harrington said. "Yes," Mason said simply. "You have grounds." Harrington made a note. "And the protocol gap. The Gen 2 framework applied to Gen 3 airframes. Is that an internal failure or both?" Mason said. "The protocol framework came from an outside consulting firm. Your internal engineering team adopted it without modification. Both parties made a decision about documentation resources that turned out to be wrong. Liability for that will depend on the contractual language, which I haven't seen." Harrington looked at Dr. Prescott. Dr. Prescott looked at the table. "The consulting firm that developed Gen 2, Harrington said slowly. "That was Harman Avionics, before the acquisition." "Yes," Mason said. "And you worked for Harman Avionics at the time the framework was developed." The room's temperature dropped about 2 degrees. "I did," Mason said. "I recommended including the secondary housing junction in the inspection protocol. The team decision was not to include it for timeline reasons. I have the original documentation if you want to review the recommendation chain." He said this without heat, without defensiveness. "I'm not going to pretend that history isn't what it is." Harrington looked at him for a long moment. "You flagged it at the time." "Yes." "And were overruled." "It wasn't exactly an overrule. It was a scope decision. The timeline pressure was real. I understood the reasoning even if I disagreed with the outcome." "But you disagreed." "Yes." Another silence. Harrington made another note. "We'll need that documentation." "I'll send it," Mason said. Across the table, one of the board members Mason hadn't yet placed, a woman in her 60s who had the bearing of someone who'd spent a career making consequential decisions and had stopped apologizing for it, leaned forward slightly. Her name was Constance Webb. She'd been the most silent person in the room until now. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Okay," he said. "You came here 2 days ago as a regional airfield mechanic. You found a systemic fleet failure that a team of specialists had been working on for nearly 3 months. You facilitated an emergency FAA directive affecting 9 operators and 43 aircraft, and you drove 4 hours home afterward. A pause. What exactly are you doing at Hargrove Regional Airfield? The question landed in the room differently than Harrington's questions had. Not a legal or technical inquiry. Something more fundamental. Mason looked at her steadily. "I'm raising my daughter," he said. Webb absorbed this. "That's an answer," she said. "It's not a complete one." "No," he agreed, "but it's the first one." She sat back. She didn't pursue it further, but something in her expression said the question wasn't closed, just filed. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. Technical questions, documentation requests, liability framework discussion, the relationship with the FAA going forward. Mason answered what he could answer and deferred what was outside his lane. At the end, Evelyn asked if there were any remaining questions for Mr. Cole before they moved to the internal portion of the session, and there was one, from the former airline executive, a man named Patterson who'd been quietly attentive throughout. "The vibration sensor," Patterson said. "The homemade one. You said the commercial version had a response lag." "Yes," Mason said. "How long have you had it?" "Built it about 8 years ago." "Before you left the industry?" "Yes," Patterson nodded slowly. "What made you keep it?" Mason thought about that for a second. "Same reason you keep anything," he said. "It works." Patterson smiled. Small, genuine, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." Mason was escorted out of the board meeting by Rachel, who told him the Carver call was scheduled for 2 p.m. and that Evelyn would want to meet with him privately afterward. He spent the intervening time in a small conference room with Jamie Okafor and Marcus, the engineer who'd flagged the Gen 3 documentation gap in 2022, working through the draft of the updated inspection protocol. That was the work Mason was most interested in, not the board meeting, not the FAA calls, not the coverage building steadily online as the day progressed and the story found its shape, but this. Sitting at a table with 2 engineers who were good at their jobs, going through a protocol document line by line and fixing the places where it was wrong. Marcus had a direct, economical working style that Mason respected. He didn't pad his reasoning or over-explain his positions, and when Mason corrected something, he took the correction without elaborating a defense of the original. Jamie was faster than she'd been in the hangar now that she understood the framework she was working inside. She asked better questions than either of them because she was younger and hadn't yet learned to assume she already knew the answer. "The secondary housing junction," Marcus said, midway through. "We need to be specific about the access procedure. The Gen 3 airframe has a tighter clearance on the portside panel than the Gen 2. Most technicians are going to try to access it the same way." "Won't work," Mason confirmed. "You need to go in from the underside panel first, remove the secondary brace, then approach from the port side. Add 60 seconds to the procedure, but eliminates the risk of incidental contact with the drive housing," Marcus typed. "How do you know the clearance spec on the Gen 3 port side?" "I've been inside 11 of them in the last 48 hours, Mason said. Marcus stopped typing. "Right," he said. "Yeah." Jamie was smiling slightly. She caught Mason noticing and didn't hide it. The Carver call at 2 o'clock was not pleasant. The attorney was aggressive in the specific way attorneys are aggressive when they're getting paid by the hour, to be aggressive on behalf of a client who knows they're going to lose but needs to feel like they tried. The technical director at Carver was a man named Glenn, who had the trapped expression of someone who genuinely wanted to do the right thing and was being prevented from doing it by people with better suits. Mason explained the failure mode again. He explained the acceleration curve. He told Glenn, directly and specifically, that without knowing where Carver's components fell in the batch production sequence, there was no way to determine where they were in the fracture progression, and that operating without that information was not a risk he could in good conscience support. "And what if our inspection shows the components are in early-stage fracture set?" the attorney said. "What if they're nowhere near the threshold?" "Then you share that documentation with the FAA and make the case for a modified grounding timeline," Mason said. "That's a legitimate process. What's not legitimate is operating the aircraft before you've completed that inspection." We haven't been able to confirm the batch documentation yet. Then ground the aircraft until you can, Mason said. That's the answer. Glenn, the technical director, said quietly, That's what I've been saying since 6 this morning. There was a brief silence on the call. The attorney said he would convey the technical assessment to his client. The call ended. Mason sat in the conference room for a minute after it ended. He thought about Glenn, who'd been sitting in meetings all day trying to say the right thing to people who didn't want to hear it. He knew that feeling from a different lifetime. He hoped Glenn would be okay. Evelyn knocked on the conference room door at 3:15. She came in alone and sat across from him at the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in a way it hadn't been 2 days ago when they'd stood in an auditorium together and operated on completely different understandings of who each of them was. The board wants to extend a formal contract, she said. Full fleet safety review. Not just the current issue, a comprehensive audit of all inspection protocols against current airframe generations. Documentation, training, implementation. She set a folder on the table. I had legal draft the initial terms this morning. I wanted to bring them to you directly before they went to anyone else. He looked at the folder. He didn't open it yet. How long a project? We estimated 4 to 6 months, she said. Realistically, with the FAA coordination and the manufacturer issues, probably 8. I have a job, he said. I know. And a kid in school. I know. She paused. The contract can be structured for partial remote work. 2 days a week on site, 3 remote. More on site during critical phases, less during documentation periods. He looked at the folder again. What does it pay? She told him. He was quiet. Per month, she said, in case that was unclear. It was clear. That was what made him quiet. He picked up the folder and opened it. The contract language was clean. Evelyn's legal team was evidently not interested in burying things in fine print, or if they were, they'd been told to stop. He read through the first 2 pages without speaking. There's something else, Evelyn said. He looked up. The board discussed your background during the internal portion of the meeting, your time at Harman Avionics, the Gen 2 protocol recommendation that didn't get implemented. She was choosing her words carefully. Constance Webb pointed out that this situation is partly the downstream consequence of a good recommendation that wasn't acted on, made by you 14 years ago. Mason set the contract pages down. Where is this going? It's not going anywhere in particular, she said. It's just, I wanted to say it out loud, that this whole thing, the failure, the 11 weeks, the 43 aircraft, it might not have happened if someone had listened to you 14 years ago. He looked at her. That's not how causation works, he said. A lot of things would have had to go differently. Different people making different calls at different companies across more than a decade. He paused. You can't run that backward and put it on one recommendation. No, she said. But you could. He understood what she meant, that he could have spent 14 years carrying the weight of a thing he'd tried to prevent and failed to prevent and eventually chosen to walk away from. She was asking, without quite asking, whether he had. He thought about what to say and then said something true. I made my peace with it when Lily was about 3. There's a limited amount of space in a day, and I needed the space for other things. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the contract on the table. Will you take it? He looked at it too. 8 months. 2 days a week on site, 3 remote. A number that would change the transmission conversation and the after-school program calculation and probably several other calculations he'd been doing quietly for 4 years. I need to think about it, he said. Give me tonight. She nodded. She stood, and she took the folder and left 1 page on the table, the financial summary, which he hadn't asked her to leave, but she left it anyway. She went to the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the frame. Mason, she said. He looked up. She wasn't looking at him directly. She was looking at some middle point between them, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen there before. In the auditorium, or the hangar, or the boardroom. Something less composed. Something that was possibly the actual version of Evelyn Hart, underneath the calibrated controls she ran on most of the time. The thing I said, she said, in the auditorium, before leaving the industry. She paused. I want you to know that when I said it, I meant it as I thought it was a neutral statement, a description. Another pause. I've been thinking about it since last night, and I know it wasn't. The way I said it, the room I said it in, the context, I was using it to establish a hierarchy. I was using it to set up the conclusion I'd already reached before you walked through the door. Mason waited. I'm sorry for that, she said. Not the professional version of sorry, the actual version. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. I could tell the difference. She nodded once. She left. He sat alone in the conference room and looked at the financial summary on the table and thought about Lily drawing a palomino named Captain, and about Mrs. Delaney and her muffins and the baby monitor on the kitchen counter, and about a toy airplane on a windowsill catching the streetlight. He thought about Sarah, who would have had opinions about all of this, and whose opinions he missed with a specific sharpness that sometimes surprised him. Not the devastating kind of missing, not anymore, but the quiet, persistent kind that lives alongside everything else and doesn't ask for attention, just presence. He thought about what 8 months looked like on the other side of itself, what a completed thing felt like when the thing was worth completing. He picked up the financial summary. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket next to the toy airplane. He had a 4-hour drive ahead of him. He went to get his toolbox. He called Evelyn at 9:16 the next morning. She answered before the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting, and knowing she'd been waiting told him something about how the night had gone for her. He'd been at the school drop-off again. Lily had turned around at the door this time and waved, which was enough to make the drive feel different. And he was sitting in the parking lot with the engine running because the November cold had come in overnight, and the truck's heater took 10 minutes to do anything useful. I'll take the contract, he said. A pause. Not surprise, exactly. More like the release of a breath that had been held carefully. Okay, she said. I have some conditions. I expected that. Not many. 3. Tell me. He'd thought about them on the drive home last night, and again lying awake at 2 a.m. when his brain had decided that sleep was optional. They weren't negotiating tactics. He wasn't built for that kind of thing, and even if he were, he didn't think Evelyn would respect it. They were actual conditions, the kind that came from knowing what he was agreeing to and what he wasn't. First one, he said. The on-site schedule is fixed. 2 days a week, Tuesday and Wednesday, unless there's a genuine emergency situation that requires more, and we agree on it in advance. I have a kid in school and a neighbor who helps with childcare, and that arrangement has a load-bearing limit. Agreed, Evelyn said. Second, the protocol work, the actual documentation, the inspection framework revision, I work with Jamie Okafor and Marcus as the primary team, not around them. I've seen how they work and I trust their judgment. I'm not interested in being brought in to sign off on other people's drafts. A brief pause. Jamie will need to be pulled off her current assignment. That's your decision to make, Mason said. I'm telling you what the working arrangement needs to look like. Agreed, she said again, with slightly less speed this time. Third? He looked out the truck window at the school building. A crossing guard was helping a line of kids navigate the crosswalk. The contract has to include a training component, he said. Not just documentation, actual hands-on training for your maintenance teams on the updated protocol. Every technician who works on these aircraft, not just the senior engineers. That wasn't in the original scope. I know, it should be. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He could hear the particular quality of her silence. The kind that's doing something, not just waiting. The board budgeted based on the original scope, she said. Adding a training component changes the resource allocation. Then the budget needs to change, Mason said. A protocol document that lives in a folder doesn't fix anything. People need to know what they're feeling for. That's not a curriculum thing. It's a time thing. You have to get your hands on the aircraft. I'm not disagreeing with the principle, she said. I'm telling you the practical constraint. I know, but it's still the condition. Another pause. Longer. He waited it out. Let me talk to the board, she said finally. I'll have an answer by end of day. That works, he said. He started driving. The answer came at 4:17 in the afternoon. A text from Rachel Thorne that said, Training component approved. Modified contract coming to you tonight. Ms. Hart says welcome to the team. He read it standing in the Hargrove break room waiting for the microwave, and he read it twice, and then he put his phone back in his pocket and ate his lunch and went back to the Piper that needed a left magneto replaced. Dale found him under the cowling 20 minutes later and said, without preamble, "You're leaving." "Not leaving," Mason said. "I need to reduce my hours here for a while, maybe 6 months, maybe longer, part-time if that works for you." Dale was quiet. Then, "The Vantage thing." "Yeah." "How part-time?" "I can give you Mondays and Fridays, full days. Some Thursdays depending on the week." Dale crossed his arms and looked at the Piper and didn't say anything for long enough that Mason looked up from the magneto. Dale's face was doing the specific thing it did when he was trying not to show what he was feeling, which was a thing Dale was not particularly good at. "You're good at this job," Dale said finally. "The job here. You know that." "I know," Mason said. "I don't say that enough." "You say it plenty," Mason said. "You said it last month when I found the cracked spar on the Beechcraft." "That's because it would have killed somebody. That's when it counts," Mason said. He went back to the magneto. "I'm not going anywhere permanently. I'll be here Mondays and Fridays." Dale uncrossed his arms. "Fine," he said. And then, because he was Dale, "I want you to know I think you should take whatever they're paying you, and I'm not even slightly offended." Mason almost smiled. "Good. And I want you to know that if it doesn't work out and you come back full-time, I will never once say I told you so." "You would absolutely say I told you so." "Correct," Dale said. "I would say it constantly, but I'd mean it nicely." He walked back toward the office, and Mason finished the magneto replacement and thought about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon in the background way that good conversations sometimes linger. He started at Vantage the following Tuesday. The first week was orientation in the purest sense, not the HR paperwork kind, though there was some of that, but the real kind. Learning the physical layout of a facility larger and more complex than anything he'd worked in for years. Meeting the maintenance teams, 12 technicians across 2 shifts, ranging from a 23-year-old named Dom, who'd come straight from an aviation technical program and had the energy of someone who hasn't yet been wrong enough times to be cautious, to a 58-year-old named Rosa, who had been with the company since the Whitmore era and knew every aircraft in the fleet by the sound of its systems on startup. Rosa was the one Mason paid most attention to. She was quiet in meetings in the way that people are quiet when they're evaluating rather than disengaged. Listening with the particular quality of someone who has strong opinions and is deciding whether the situation merits expressing them. She did her inspections methodically, without rushing, with a thoroughness that told you she'd made decisions a long time ago about what the job required and had never renegotiated them. She had strong hands and a habit of wiping them on a rag she kept in her back pocket, even when they weren't dirty, which was a mechanic's tick Mason recognized from people who'd spent decades doing work where your hands told you things. He introduced himself to her directly at the end of his first day, which he'd had to find a moment to do because she hadn't come to him. She was finishing a post-maintenance check on Aircraft 3, one of the first to have its fractured component replaced and returned to service, and she looked up from the logbook when he approached with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this but wasn't going to rush toward it. "Rosa Delgado," she said, and shook his hand. "Mason Cole. I know who you are." She said it without any particular tone. "I've been here since Gerald Whitmore's time, seen a few consultants come through." "I imagine. Most of them tell us what's in a manual we already own." "That's not the plan," Mason said. She looked at him steadily. "What is the plan?" "You tell me what I don't know about these aircraft," he said. "And I show you one thing the inspection protocol's been missing, and we figure out together how to make sure it doesn't get missed again." Rosa looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the logbook. "Aircraft 3 has been making a sound on the portside startup sequence," she said. "Not in any log because it's inconsistent. Every third or fourth startup, a kind of harmonic note in the first 30 seconds. Then nothing." "How long?" 7 weeks. "I've mentioned it twice. Both times the diagnostic came back clean." "I'd like to hear it," Mason said. Rosa looked at him again. This time the expression was different. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 6 a.m. startup." "I'll be here," he said. He was. At 6 a.m. In the cold dark of the hangar, with Rosa running the startup sequence and Mason standing 6 feet from the portside engine nacelle with his eyes closed and his hand resting lightly on the fuselage, the harmonic note appeared exactly where Rosa had said it would. A subtle resonance in the first 22 seconds of operation that vanished before anyone who hadn't been listening specifically for it would have noticed. It took him 4 days and 2 conversations with Marcus to identify it as a minor imbalance in the portside fan blade assembly. Not dangerous at current parameters, but worth addressing before it progressed. It went into the logbook properly this time, with a repair order, and Rosa watched him write it up with an expression that said she was revising something internally and wasn't bothered about admitting it. 7 weeks, she said. You were right to flag it, he said. The diagnostic missed it for the same reason it missed the clip fractures. Different issue, same principle. The system looks for what it's programmed to find. So what do we do about that? We change what we're programmed to find, he said, and we change who does the looking. That was the conversation that became the framework for the training component. Not a curriculum in any formal sense. Mason didn't have the patience for formal curriculum design and didn't pretend to. What he built instead, with Rosa's input and Jamie's logistical support and Marcus's documentation skills, was something closer to apprenticeship. A structured series of hands-on sessions where the maintenance team worked alongside him on actual aircraft, developing the tactile vocabulary for the things that sensors couldn't yet articulate. He taught them what to listen for, what to feel for, how to distinguish between a vibration signature that was normal for a specific airframe generation and one that wasn't. He taught them how to think about the gaps in their own protocols, not with anxiety, but with the specific alertness of people who understand that the things nobody checks are the things most likely to develop problems. Rosa sat in on every session. She rarely spoke during them, but afterward, when the technicians had questions they weren't sure how to ask Mason directly, they asked Rosa, and Rosa had answers because she'd been paying attention in a way that suggested she was planning to carry these things forward long after the consultant's contract ended. Mason noticed this and was glad for it, and didn't say anything about it because saying something about it would have been the wrong thing to do. The weeks organized themselves around the rhythm he'd established. Tuesdays and Wednesdays at Vantage, Mondays and Fridays at Hargrove, where Dale had quietly rearranged the schedule so Mason's reduced days lined up with the work he was best at and the tasks that didn't require him to be there 5 days running. Thursdays were variable, sometimes Hargrove, sometimes Vantage if a documentation deadline required it, sometimes when the week had been what weeks sometimes were, just being home when Lily got off the bus. Lily knew something had changed in the way children know things, not from information, but from texture. Daddy was driving farther away more often, coming home later on certain nights, sometimes on the phone in the kitchen after her bedtime. But Daddy was also, and this was the part she registered more than she could articulate, different in some way that felt like more rather than less. Not more gone, more present when he was there. She couldn't have explained why. She just knew that sometimes at dinner he told her about what he was working on in a way he hadn't before, and it sounded like something he wanted to tell her rather than something he was filling silence with. She still hadn't asked about the toy airplane in his pocket. She was 6, and the things you've always known about your parents exist in a category that doesn't require questions. The formal crisis point of the project came in week 5. The FAA, working from Mason's failure documentation and the Dalton batch records, had identified 3 additional aircraft beyond the original 43, aircraft from a secondary batch that had come off the same production line within a 6-week window after the primary bad batch, using components from the same raw material stock that had contained the microvoid defect. The secondary batch had been considered clean in the initial review because it didn't match the primary batch serial numbers, and the batch documentation had listed it under a separate order number. Mason had flagged the possibility of a secondary batch in his original FAA statement. He'd noted it as a low-probability scenario that should be investigated. Someone had put that note in a file and not investigated it for 5 weeks, and now there were 3 aircraft in question that hadn't been grounded under the original directive because they hadn't been identified. 2 of them were currently active. 1 was on the ground in Denver. 1 was in the air. He was in the Vantage conference room with Jamie and Marcus when the call came in from Director Chalk's office. Rachel Thorne put her head in the door with an expression that Mason had not seen on her face before. Not the efficient calm she wore as a professional garment, but something underneath it. "There's a situation," she said. "Ms. Hart needs you both. Now." Both meant Mason and Jamie. They went. The operations center was a room Mason hadn't spent much time in. It was more Evelyn's domain, the place where the active fleet was managed, where the radio communications and flight tracking systems lived. It was smaller than he expected and more crowded than usual when they walked in. Evelyn was at the main console with her operations director, a man named Sato, who had the compressed focus of someone managing a situation he'd been trained for but hoped never to actually encounter. On the central tracking screen, one aircraft indicator was moving. A Vantage fleet aircraft, not Vantage's own, but an aircraft from one of the 9 operators in the original grounding, an operator named Meridian Charter out of Ohio. The aircraft had taken off 40 minutes ago on a route from Columbus to Washington. It had not been flagged under the original grounding directive because its batch documentation had listed it under the secondary order number. "We got the match 6 minutes ago," Evelyn said, not turning from the screen. "FAA is initiating the divert order now. The pilot is being contacted." "What's the flight time remaining?" Mason asked. 58 minutes to destination, Sato said. 44 to the nearest divert airport. "How many passengers?" 7, Sato said. "Plus 2 crew." Mason looked at the tracking display. He looked at where the aircraft was, and the route line, and the divert airport marker. He did math that wasn't really math. It was the kind of calculation you make when you've spent 48 hours with a fracture progression curve in your head, and you're now looking at an aircraft that has been operating in cold weather conditions on daily cycles for the better part of a year. "What's the current flight duration?" he asked. "Not this flight. Total flight hours since delivery." Sato checked. He read the number. Mason looked at Evelyn. "Divert immediately, but," he said. "Don't wait for the administrative process. Divert now." Evelyn looked at Sato. "Where are we with the FAA contact?" "They're patching through to the pilot now," Sato said. 2 minutes. 2 minutes was 2 minutes. Mason knew what 2 minutes was when you were talking about an aircraft at altitude with a component that was at the far end of a fracture progression timeline. He also knew that the aircraft had not failed yet, that the failure mode was progressive, not sudden, and that 58 flight hours past the threshold didn't mean the next 60 seconds. But he knew what past the threshold meant. He'd built the curve. He understood what it said. "Get Meridian's operations center on the line," he said to Sato. "Simultaneously. Don't wait for FAA to relay. Get their operations director on the phone right now and tell them their aircraft is not in compliance with the airworthiness directive and needs to divert." Sato looked at Evelyn. "Do it," she said. The next 18 minutes were the closest thing to what Mason imagined the inside of Evelyn's job looked like when it was at its most real. Multiple simultaneous conversations, information arriving in fragments, the specific tension of a situation where the right outcome depended on people making the right decisions in the right sequence faster than was comfortable. The FAA contact reached the pilot. Meridian's operations director was on the line within 4 minutes, a man named Walsh who, to his significant credit, did not argue for a single second when the situation was explained to him. He confirmed the divert immediately. The aircraft turned. It landed at the divert airport 31 minutes later. On the ground, an inspection team that FAA had mobilized from a regional office was waiting for it. The passengers were deplaned. The aircraft was quarantined pending inspection. 3 hours after landing, the inspection team confirmed. Both components, the one in the secondary drive assembly and a second one that hadn't been on anyone's radar, a companion clip in a slightly different position on the same assembly, were fractured. The second one was at a stage of propagation that, according to Mason's acceleration model, was within approximately 12 to 15 flight hours of potential load transfer to the primary housing. Walsh, Meridian's operations director, called Mason directly that evening. He'd gotten the number from Evelyn's office. He didn't have a speech prepared. He just said, "I wanted to call you personally. I have a family that flies with us regularly, 3 kids. They were booked on that aircraft next week." A pause. "I wanted you to know that," Mason said. I'm glad it worked out. It wasn't enough of a thing to say. He knew that, but Walsh seemed to understand that there wasn't a better version of it, and they ended the call without ceremony, and Mason sat in his truck in the Vantage parking lot for a few minutes before he drove home. Evelyn found him there before he left. She came out of the building at 7:15 in the jacket she'd had on all day, no coat despite the cold, and she walked across the parking lot to where his truck was sitting under one of the lot lights. He had the window down. She stopped next to it and put her hand on the door frame the way people do when they don't want to be standing in a parking lot having a conversation, but are going to anyway. "Walsh called you," she said. "Yeah." "The family with the kids?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. The parking lot was mostly empty. A wind had come up, and it was cold enough to be uncomfortable, but neither of them moved. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "In the operations center today, when you looked at that tracking screen," she paused, "you knew. Before the FAA call went through, you knew it needed to divert right then." "I knew the fracture timeline was," he said. "I didn't know what would happen. There's a difference." "But you said it anyway. Divert now." She looked at him. "That's not a technical calculation. That's a judgment call." "It's both," he said. "You made it in about 4 seconds." He looked at the windshield. The lot light was making a yellow oval on the hood of the truck. "I've been wrong before," he said, "about judgment calls. Different situation, but wrong." He paused. "I flagged the secondary housing junction 14 years ago and got overruled. I accepted it. I shouldn't have pushed harder. You were one person on a team." "I know. I'm not flagellating myself. I'm just saying that judgment calls aren't always right. Today it was. Other times it isn't." He looked at her. "What I said in the auditorium was true. Data tells you where the symptoms are, but at a certain point you have to make a call about what the symptoms mean, and that call comes from somewhere that isn't data." Evelyn was quiet for a long time, long enough that a car drove by on the main road and they both watched it. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to say it outside, not in a conference room, because I've been saying everything in conference rooms for 6 weeks, and it starts to feel like everything is a meeting." "Okay," he said. "I've been running this company since I was 28. I took over from a man who built it from nothing and had a stroke in a board meeting and handed it to me, and I was not—" She stopped. "I was not as ready as I presented myself as being. I was close to ready, but not completely. And there are things I've done in the last 2 years that were about managing the perception of readiness more than they were about actually being right." She paused. "What I did in the auditorium, that was one of them. I saw you walk in and I made a calculation about how the room would read the situation, and I used that calculation to establish myself. And it was—" She found the word she was looking for— cynical. "I was cynical." Mason looked at her. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know it wasn't accidental and it wasn't just a snap judgment. It was a deliberate choice, and it was wrong, and I've been sitting with that for 6 weeks, and I don't want to sit with it silently anymore." He took that in. He didn't rush past it. "Why are you telling me now?" he asked. "You said something about it in the conference room 3 days in, the actual version of sorry conversation." "That was still in a conference room," she said, "with a contract on the table." He understood what she meant. "All right," he said. "Is that—" She almost smiled, and it wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "You said that before. In the auditorium, I asked you something and you said, 'all right,' and I didn't know what to do with it." "It means I heard you," he said. "It means I believe you. It doesn't fix the thing, but I believe you." She nodded. "That's fair." The cold was real now. She crossed her arms against it. "You know what surprised me most?" she said. "In the hangar that first day, not the component. Finding the component was extraordinary, but I could fit that into a framework I understood. Expertise, experience, someone knowing more than the people in the room." She paused. "It was after, when Dr. Prescott said something dismissive at the beginning, and then later came to stand next to you looking at those 12 components. And you said something about him not seeing the memo, that you believed him." "I do believe him," Mason said. "Most people in your position, having been dismissed the way he dismissed you in front of the room, would not have been generous about it." Generosity wasn't the point, Mason said. He runs a good engineering operation. He made an error. Holding the error over him doesn't fix the protocol. It just makes the work harder. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Does that come naturally to you, or did you learn it? He thought about that honestly. Some of both, he said. After Sarah died, I spent about 8 months being angry at things. Not useful angry, just angry at the way situations had gone, the choices that had been made, the way the timing worked out. And I burned through it eventually. By the time Lily was 3, I was pretty much done with that version of things. He paused. You can't do the work while you're carrying the grudge. The grudge takes up room. Evelyn was quiet. The wind pushed across the parking lot, and she pulled her jacket tighter. You should go inside, Bissell, he said. It's cold. I know, she said. But she didn't move immediately. I looked you up, she said, after the first day. Your full career history, not just what was on the file Rachel sent me, the actual paper trail. She paused. The resonance dampening specification you submitted to the Gen 2 framework team. I found it in the Harman Avionics archive. They digitized their records when Prescott acquired them. Your recommendation was clear. You cited exactly the failure mode we just spent 11 weeks looking for. Mason said nothing. 14 years ago, she said. You saw it. I saw a risk, he said. Not the exact failure, the category. It's the same thing. It isn't quite, he said, but close enough. She looked at him with something that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration and wasn't either of the simple versions of what she was feeling. The company should have known who you were when Rachel made that first call, she said. Not because it would have changed the outcome. Maybe you would have found it regardless of how you were treated walking in, but because it was the right thing to know. You couldn't have known, Mason said. I was listed as maintenance staff at a regional airfield. That's accurate. The research was a phone call, she said. One call. To the right person in the Harman record system. She paused. I didn't make it because I'd already decided what you were before you walked through the door. He looked at her steadily. You've said this more than once. I know, I'm still working through it. That's honest, he said. She took a breath and let it out, and some of the controlled tension she'd been carrying went with it. Not all of it, but some. I should go back in, she said. You should, he said. It's cold. She pushed off the door frame and took a step back, then she stopped. Mason, the training sessions. Rosa Delgado told me this week that the way your team is working together, the maintenance staff, the engineers, it's different than it's been. She said that in 12 years here, she'd never seen a working session where someone with your background sat on the floor of the hangar and showed a 23-year-old technician how to listen to a resonance pattern by putting their hand on a fuselage. Mason said, Dom's got good instincts. He just hasn't learned to trust them yet. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Right, she said, and this time she actually smiled. Small, not performed, the kind that comes out because something has caught you off guard in a way you didn't expect to like. Good night, Mason. Good night, he said. He watched her walk back across the parking lot and through the glass doors and disappear into the lit interior of the building. He sat for a moment in the cold with the windows still down. He could see the operations center windows from where he was parked. The lights still on, Sato presumably still at the console, the tracking system still running. He rolled the window up and started the truck. On the seat beside him, his phone showed a text from Mrs. Delaney. Lily is asleep. She made you a drawing of an airplane. She says it's the one in your pocket, but more colorful. Gerald required a bedtime story about a horse named Captain. I improvised. It went well. He read it twice. He texted back, "Thank you. Home by 10. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the Vantage parking lot and drove north through the dark, and the heater was finally working properly by the time he hit the highway, which was better than most nights. At the halfway point, he stopped for gas and coffee. A gas station he'd stopped at before on these drives. The same one where the teenager behind the counter always looked mildly surprised to see another customer regardless of the time of day. He stood at the coffee station and poured a medium dark roast into a paper cup and put a lid on it and stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light of a gas station at 9 p.m., A man in a flannel shirt with a toy airplane in his pocket, and a 4-year-old truck with a heater that took too long. He thought about Walsh's phone call, the family with 3 kids, the flight booked for next week. He thought about 12 components in a line on a cloth in a hangar, from least fractured to most, telling a story that took shape over months. He thought about Dom, the 23-year-old technician, putting his hand flat on an aircraft fuselage in the early morning of a training session and going very still when he felt something that wasn't in any diagnostic readout, and looking over at Mason with an expression of sudden recognition, like a person who has just been shown a sense they didn't know they had. He thought about Rosa, who had flagged a harmonic note 7 weeks before anyone listened, because she'd been doing this long enough to know when something wasn't right, even if she couldn't put the number on it. He paid for the coffee and got back in the truck. He was home by 9:53. Lily's drawing was on the kitchen table. It was, as Mrs. Delaney had described, an airplane, chrome-colored in the body, because Lily had used a silver crayon, but with what appeared to be a rainbow trailing behind it, which was not aerodynamically standard, but showed a certain confidence in the subject matter. In the corner, in the careful, oversized letters of a child who has recently become proud of her handwriting, "For Daddy." He stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then he went and got the tape from the drawer and added it to the refrigerator next to the other one. 2 airplanes now. The first one had been there so long the tape had yellowed at the corners. The new one was bright and silver with a rainbow behind it, slightly crooked on the door because he'd put it up without measuring. He stood back and looked at both of them. He took the toy airplane out of his shirt pocket and set it on the counter, where it had been sitting for weeks now, moved from the windowsill to the counter and back, always somewhere in the kitchen, always in a spot where the light could find it. He made a note on the back of a receipt to call Dale in the morning about the Friday schedule. He made another note to follow up with Marcus on the training documentation timeline. He went to check on Lily. She was asleep. Same angle of jaw, same relaxed brow, Gerald the rabbit somewhere under the covers with his ear visible. On the nightstand, a library book about horses that hadn't been there last week. He stood in the doorway for a while. Then he went to bed, and this time he slept straight through until the alarm. The all-hands meeting was Evelyn's idea, and she told Mason about it on a Tuesday morning in late January, standing in the corridor outside the operations center with 2 cups of coffee, the way they'd fallen into the habit of doing when the schedule aligned, a 10-minute overlap between his arrival and her first meeting of the day, where they talked through whatever needed talking through without the formality of a conference room. "I want to do it before the contract ends," she said. "Not as a closing ceremony, as something different." "Different how?" Mason asked. "I want to talk to the whole company, everyone. Maintenance staff, engineers, admin, operations, flight crew, the people who were in the auditorium that first day, and the people who weren't." She held her coffee with both hands. "I want to talk about what happened here. Not the technical version, the other version." Mason looked at her. "What's the other version?" "The one about how we almost missed it," she said. "Not almost missed the component failure. That's the technical story. The other almost. The one where we had the right person in the room, and I made sure the room treated him like he didn't belong there." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "It's my company, and it's my mistake to account for. I'm telling you because you deserve to know it's coming, and because—" She paused. "Because I'd like you to be there." "I'll be there," he said. She nodded and went to her first meeting, and Mason went to the hangar, and he thought about it on and off for the rest of the day, in the way you think about something that you're not sure how to feel about yet. The meeting was set for a Friday morning, 3 weeks later. By then, the contract work was in its final phase. The inspection protocol revision was complete, fully documented, and had been submitted to the FAA as part of Vantage's compliance package. The training sessions had run through all 12 technicians, with a follow-up series scheduled to begin in March for the engineering staff. The Dalton manufacturer liability claim had been filed and was moving through its own slow legal process that Mason was not involved in and was happy not to be. The fleet was fully operational, all 12 aircraft back in service with new components, new protocols, new logbook procedures that Rosa had helped design and that bore her particular imprint, thorough, unambiguous, with no room for the kind of comfortable assumptions that had allowed an inspection gap to persist for years. The Friday of the meeting, Mason drove in from the drop-off at Lily's school, the same way he always did. He'd told Lily the night before that he had a special thing at work today and might be a little later than usual. And she'd said okay with the equanimity of a child who has recalibrated her understanding of what Daddy's work looks like over the past few months. She was used to the longer days now. She'd stopped asking why and started asking how late instead, which was more useful information anyway. He arrived at 8:40. The Whitmore Auditorium was the room again, because of course it was. And walking in through the same side door he'd come through on that November morning with the same toolbox, Mason felt the geometry of the situation in a way that would have been easier to dismiss as too neat if it weren't simply what was happening. Same room, same seats, different everything else. Or almost everything else. The auditorium filled the same way it had before. The same general distribution. Maintenance staff in the lower section, engineers and department heads in the middle, administrative staff and operations people filling in around them. The flight crew, which had been mostly absent from the first event, was present now. 8 pilots and 6 crew members in the far left section, which Mason noticed because pilots have a specific posture in rooms that aren't cockpits, a watchful readiness that's different from engineers or executives. Rosa Delgado was in the 3rd row, center section, sitting next to Dom. Marcus was 2 rows behind them. Jamie Okafor was in the front row, with a tablet she wasn't looking at. Dr. Prescott was on the stage, seated to the left of the main podium, which was a different configuration than last time. He caught Mason's eye when Mason came through the side door and gave a short nod. Mason returned it. Evelyn came in from the main entrance, not the stage door, and walked through the auditorium to the stage the long way. Through the crowd, not above it. Mason noticed this. He thought it was probably deliberate, and that was fine. Most things Evelyn did were deliberate. What mattered was whether the deliberateness was in service of something true. She stepped onto the stage and stood at the podium and looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. She didn't shuffle papers or adjust the microphone or do any of the preparatory things people do when they're nervous. She was not performing composure. She was just composing herself, which was different. "I want to start by telling you what I did wrong," she said. The room settled. "About 3 months ago, I invited an independent specialist to consult on our fleet safety problem. He came here on a November morning with a toolbox and a toy airplane in his shirt pocket. And before he'd said 10 words in this room, I used the way he looked and where he'd been working to tell this room, and to tell him, that I wasn't taking him seriously." She paused. "I did it because I was managing a perception. I was managing how the investors saw me, how the board saw me, how the engineers saw me. I made a calculation about control, and the calculation had nothing to do with whether I was right about the person standing in front of me." She looked across the room. "I was not right about him. I was wrong in almost every specific way a person can be wrong about another person. And the fact that the story turned out the way it did, the fact that he stayed in that room and did the work anyway, and found what we couldn't find, and helped us prevent something that could have ended this company and cost people their lives, that doesn't make what I did acceptable. It makes it more uncomfortable, because it means I got to benefit from a grace I hadn't earned." The auditorium was very quiet. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to see me being humble," she continued. "I've watched enough leadership performance to know what that looks like, and I don't want to do it. I'm telling you because what I did in this room that morning is a version of something that happens in organizations every day. And it happened here because I allowed a culture where it could happen, where what someone looks like, where they come from, what their title is, how they were introduced, where those things determine whether we actually listen to them." She stopped. "That's on me. As the person running this company, that's on me." She looked toward the side of the stage where Mason was standing. "Mason," she said, "will you come up here?" He walked onto the stage with his toolbox, the same way he'd done it 3 months ago, and this time the room's response was the reverse of what it had been. Not silence in the sense of waiting for something to be confirmed. Silence in the sense of a room that is paying a specific kind of attention. He set the toolbox down and looked at the auditorium. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I do." A ripple of something through the room. Not laughter. Something warmer. "What I can tell you is what I know from the work we did here these past few months," he said. "And what I know is that the problem we found, the component failure, the protocol gap, That's the kind of thing that happens when an organization stops questioning what it already knows. The inspection protocol was wrong because everybody used it, and nobody asked whether it was right. The vibration signature was missed because the diagnostic system was programmed to look for what had already been identified as a risk, not for what hadn't been identified yet. He paused. The same thing happens with people. You build a model of who matters and what they look like, and then you stop looking. He thought about what he wanted to say and what he didn't want to say, and he chose carefully. Rosa Delgado flagged a harmonic anomaly in aircraft 37 weeks before anyone listened to it, he said. She was right. She'd been right for 7 weeks. He looked at Rosa in the third row. She didn't change expression, but something in her posture shifted. Not pride exactly, but the specific straightening of someone whose accuracy has been acknowledged in a room full of people. If you want to know where the real expertise in this company lives, some of it is in the engineering department, and some of it is in the inspection reports, and some of it is standing in a hangar at 6 a.m. listening to an aircraft tell you something is wrong. The question isn't whether that expertise exists, it's whether your culture lets it reach you. He stopped. Evelyn stepped back to the podium. Starting today, she said, Vantage is implementing a formal protocol for cross-level technical flagging. Any employee, in any department, at any level, can submit a technical observation directly to the engineering review team without it going through their direct supervisor first. Observations are reviewed within 48 hours and responded to in writing. She paused. That's the structural piece. But structures don't change cultures. What changes cultures is whether people in this room believe the structure means something, and whether the people running this company act like it does. She looked at Mason. I also want to formally announce that we've offered Mason Cole a continued consulting relationship with Vantage for the next calendar year, focused on the next generation protocol development and the training program expansion. She paused. He accepted this morning. He had in fact accepted at 7:58 a.m. in the parking lot when Evelyn had sent him the modified terms by text with the message, "Changes you asked for are in. Your call." He'd read them, found they said what she'd said they'd say, and texted back, yes, no negotiation, no ceremony, the same way they'd been doing things for 3 months. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Department heads presenting changes to their operating procedures, Rachel walking through the new cross-level flagging system, Dr. Prescott delivering a technical summary of the protocol revisions that was concise and accurate and notably free of the defensive undertone it might have had 3 months ago. He was not a different person than he'd been on that November afternoon. He was the same person, working with corrected information, which was all anyone could really ask. Afterward, people came to Mason in the way people come to someone in a crowd after something public has happened. Not in a line, not organized, just gradually, the way a group forms around a point. Some of them were engineers he'd worked with during the protocol revision. Some were technicians from the training sessions. Dom shook his hand with both of his and said, I've been practicing what you showed me, the vibration thing. I can feel it now with the slightly embarrassed enthusiasm of someone sharing something they're not sure how to contextualize. Rosa came last. She waited until the cluster around Mason had thinned and then walked over and stood in front of him with the same direct, unadorned manner she brought to everything. You didn't have to say my name up there, she said. I didn't have to, he agreed. But you did. 7 weeks is 7 weeks, he said. She looked at him. You know what's going to happen now? People are going to start flagging things, real things and some not real things, because that's what happens when you open a channel. Someone's going to flag something that turns out to be nothing, and someone's going to look foolish, and someone's going to want to close the channel back up. Probably, Mason said. You going to be here when that happens? I'll be here Tuesday and Wednesday, he said. Rosa nodded. She put out her hand and he shook it. Good, she said, and walked out of the auditorium with the same unhurried pace she walked everywhere. The contract year that followed was not the clean, ascending arc that stories sometimes manufacture for their endings. It was a year of actual work, which meant it had the texture of actual work, progress and setbacks and long stretches of unglamorous documentation and meetings that went too long, and at least 2 instances where Mason was wrong about something and had to go back and fix it, and 1 instance where a training session with the night shift maintenance team went badly because Mason misjudged the room and was too technical too fast, and Dom, who had by that point become something like the unofficial bridge between Mason's approach and the newer technicians, had to quietly recalibrate the next session's opening. Mason learned to let Dom do that. It took him a while. He was not naturally someone who delegated the teaching, because teaching was the part he cared about most, and the instinct was to hold on to the things you care about. But Dom was good at reading people in a way Mason was not, and the training program needed both of those things, and eventually Mason got out of Dom's way on the human end of the sessions and trusted him, and the sessions got better for it. That was its own lesson, and Mason was old enough to know it when he was learning it, which didn't make it faster but did make it more honest. The cross-level flagging system Rosa had predicted would be complicated was, in fact, complicated. In the first 3 months, it generated 41 submissions. 33 were real observations that led to some form of review or action, some minor, some not minor, one that caught a hydraulic fitting misalignment on aircraft 9 that would have become a maintenance headache within 60 days. 8 were submissions that turned out to be misunderstandings of normal operating parameters, and all 8 were responded to in writing, explaining what the technician had observed and why it was within expected range. And all 8 of the technicians involved submitted follow-up observations in subsequent months, which told Mason that being wrong once and being treated respectfully about it was, counterintuitively, the best way to produce better observers. He wrote that down. He wrote a lot of things down that year, not because he'd been asked to, but because he was in the habit of recording what he learned, and he was learning things. Evelyn changed too, which was harder to observe directly because she was not the kind of person who documented her own internal revisions. But Mason saw it in smaller things. In the way she ran the weekly engineering briefings, she'd started attending them, which she hadn't done before, and she sat in the back rather than at the head of the table, which was a small thing with a large signal. In the way she handled a situation in April when a junior engineer named Park submitted a flagging observation that contradicted a conclusion in Dr. Prescott's department report, and instead of managing it through back channels, Evelyn convened a technical review that included Park and Prescott in the same room and let the evidence settle the question. Park was right. Prescott updated the report. Nobody quit. The sky didn't fall. Prescott, for his part, was different by the end of the year than he'd been in November, in a way Mason hadn't anticipated. He was not a humble man by nature, and he didn't become one. But he became someone who asked questions he hadn't been asking before. Not performatively, but in the specific way of an engineer who has been reminded that the most important questions are often the ones that feel unnecessary. He started auditing his own department's protocols quarterly, which was new, and he brought Mason in to consult on 2 of those audits, which required both of them to navigate a dynamic that had some history in it. They did it without making a production of it. They were both too old for productions. In June, the Dalton manufacturer liability case settled. Mason was not party to the settlement and didn't know the terms. He knew the outcome mattered to the company and to the 9 operators who'd been caught in the grounding, and he knew that Meridian Charter's Walsh had been one of the stronger voices in the operator coalition, and he hoped the settlement was fair, and he moved on. In August, the FAA published updated airworthiness guidance that incorporated the secondary housing junction inspection procedure, written in its technical core from Mason's documentation, though the language had been processed through 2 layers of regulatory editing until it read the way regulatory guidance reads, correct and colorless. He read it on his phone one morning in the Hargrove break room while waiting for a diagnostic tool to reboot, and he felt something he couldn't precisely name, not pride, because pride felt like the wrong word for a feeling that was more quiet than that, closer to completion. The sense of something arriving at where it was supposed to end up, after a longer route than anyone had planned. He called Dale over and showed him the guidance notice on his phone. Dale read it, looked up, and said, "That's you." "Mostly," Mason said. Dale handed back the phone and said, "Come on, the Cessna's ready." And that was that. And they went back to work. Dale had asked Mason 6 months into the reduced schedule whether he was planning to come back full-time when the Vantage contract was done. Mason had said he didn't know yet. Dale had said okay and hadn't asked again, which was the correct amount of pressure for the situation, which was why Mason and Dale had worked together for 4 years without a significant disagreement. The honest answer, which Mason turned over in his mind on various drives between Hargrove and Vantage, and back again, was that the question had gotten more complicated. Not because of money, though the financial picture had shifted in ways that changed what coming back full-time even meant. But because of what the year had shown him about what he was still capable of and what he still cared about, and whether those two things could only be honored in the way he'd been honoring them for 4 years. He didn't resolve that question during the contract year. He sat with it the way he sat with mechanical problems he hadn't yet solved, present to the question, not forcing the answer, trusting that the right information would arrive when he'd done enough of the work to receive it. Lily turned 7 in March, and the birthday party was at the apartment with 5 kids from her class and Mrs. Delaney, who made a cake in the shape of a horse because Lily had been asked what she wanted and had said a palomino named Captain and Mrs. Delaney, who was 71 and had strong opinions about children's birthdays, had simply gone ahead and made that happen. The cake was technically a horse. It was recognizably a palomino. It was not exactly Captain, but Lily had declared it close enough with the magnanimity of a birthday girl who has learned to appreciate effort. Mason took a photograph of it and looked at the photograph sometimes when he was sitting in a conference room and needed to remember what the other end of the day looked like. He also, that month, moved the baby monitor from the kitchen counter to a drawer. He stood in front of the drawer for a moment after he put it in, and then he closed the drawer and walked away. And it was a small thing, and it was not a small thing, and he didn't make a ceremony of it. The all-hands meeting that Evelyn had called in February had been covered by 2 aviation trade publications, briefly, without great fanfare, as part of the broader coverage of the Vantage safety response. One of the articles, in a publication called Aviation Operations Weekly, included a paragraph describing Mason's role that was factually accurate and professionally framed, and mentioned the auditorium moment in the kind of careful, third-party language that implied it had not reflected well on the people involved without naming anyone directly. Evelyn read it and sent Mason a text that said, "Fair enough." He agreed. What the articles didn't cover, because it wasn't the kind of thing that translated to print, was the specific texture of what changed at Vantage over that year, not the policies or the protocols. Those were documentable. The other thing, the way a 23-year-old technician started trusting what his hands told him, because someone had showed him that his hands were an instrument worth trusting. The way a 58-year-old mechanic stopped putting notes in a mental file labeled things I observed but wasn't heard on, and started putting them in the actual flagging system. Because the actual flagging system now sent a written response within 48 hours that treated what she'd observed as worth responding to. The way engineers and maintenance staff started having conversations in the hangar that hadn't happened before. Not kumbaya conversations, not forced team building, but practical conversations between people who were doing work together, and had started to notice that the other person knew something they didn't, which is the oldest and most reliable engine of actual collaboration. None of that was Mason alone. He was clear about this to himself, even when he was less clear to other people. He'd found a component and built a framework, but the framework only worked because Evelyn had decided to hold it up, and Rosa had decided to use it, and Dom had decided to learn it, and Marcus had decided to document it in a way that meant it would survive past the contract period. What Mason had done was make a case, and cases don't change anything on their own. What changes things is whether the people with the authority to act decide the case is worth acting on. Evelyn had decided it was. He respected her for that more than he'd told her. The last day of the contract was a Wednesday in November, almost exactly a year after Mason had first walked through the Vantage lobby with his toolbox and his visitor badge. Evelyn had proposed a dinner, the 2 of them, and Jamie and Marcus and Rosa, which was an unusual configuration for a Vantage social event and was entirely deliberate on Evelyn's part. Mason had said yes because it was the right group. The restaurant was unremarkable in the way good restaurants are when they're not trying to be anything other than good. A small Italian place 20 minutes from the complex, the kind where the menu doesn't change much and the people who work there have been working there long enough to know the regulars. Evelyn had picked it. He'd noticed that the places she chose for things that weren't performative tended to be quieter and more human than the places she went when she was being the CEO of something. They ate, and they talked the way people talk when they've been working closely on something for a year and don't need to explain their shorthand. Rosa told a story about a hydraulic inspection that had gone wrong in the Whitmore era. A story she'd apparently told before in smaller settings, but had never told in a room that included management. And she told it with the specific timing of someone who knows how to land a story and had been waiting for the right room. Everyone at the table laughed, which was the correct response, and Evelyn laughed hardest, which was also the correct response. Marcus gave Mason a bound copy of the Complete Inspection Protocol revision, not the official FAA submission version, but the working version, with all the margin notes and revision history still intact. It was about 200 pages and had both their names on the cover page, and Jamie's and Rosa's. Mason looked at it for a moment and said thank you, and meant it in a way that was hard to put simply. At some point during the second course, Jamie said, "What happens next? For you?" It was a direct question, which was why Mason answered it directly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I have a standing offer here that I need to give an answer on. I have a job at Hargrove that I've been doing 4 years, and I have a 7-year-old who is very committed to a fictional horse named Captain." "What does she think you should do?" Jamie asked. "She thinks I should get a horse," Mason said, "but her thinking on that is motivated." Rosa said, "What do you want to do?" The table went slightly quieter, the way tables go when the right question arrives. Mason looked at his glass. He thought about what honest sounded like when you'd been carrying a question for a while. "I want to do work that matters," he said. "I did that for a long time and then I stopped, and I told myself I'd stopped because of circumstances. And that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. Part of it was that I was tired and I was sad. And the easiest thing was to find a quiet version of the work I knew and stay there." He paused. "Hargrove was never just a compromise. It's real work. And Dale is a good person, and I found things there I didn't expect to find." He paused again. "But this year was different, and I know it was different, and I'm not sure I can unknow that." The table received this without fuss, which was the right way to receive it. Evelyn didn't say anything immediately. She was the last person at the table to speak, which was different from how she usually operated, and it was deliberate. "The offer on the table," she said, "is not the same structure as the last contract. It's a permanent position. Head of Fleet Safety Innovation, which is a title I made up 3 weeks ago, because what I actually want is someone whose job it is to ask the questions that nobody's programmed to ask. Not a consultant. Someone who's here." She looked at Mason steadily. "I know what that means for your schedule and your life and your arrangements. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to consider it with actual seriousness, not just as an option you put down so you can say you considered it." Mason looked at her. "I know the difference," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I said it." He took the contract documents she'd left at his place at the table, and she'd had them there from the start, which was a Evelyn move, preparation as a form of respect, and put them in his jacket pocket. He drove home that night through a November that felt different from the November before, though the road was the same and the truck was the same, and the heater still took 10 minutes to get going properly. He drove past the gas station where he'd stopped all those months ago and didn't stop this time. He drove through the quiet streets of the neighborhood where he lived and parked in the same parking lot under the same lights and sat in the truck for the same ritual moment of transition. Then he went upstairs. Mrs. Delaney had left a note. "She's asleep. Told me tonight that she wants to be an engineer when she grows up. Asked me what engineers do. I said they figure out how things work. She said that's what Daddy does. I said, yes, it is." She seemed satisfied with that and went to sleep. He stood in the kitchen and read the note twice. The toy airplane was on the windowsill. He'd stopped putting it in his pocket for every trip. It lived on the windowsill now, part of the kitchen's permanent geography, in the spot where the ambient light from outside could find it. He picked it up and held it on his palm for a moment, the way he'd held it in the hangar on the first day, not dramatically, just the way you hold something you've carried long enough that it has its own weight. He thought about Sarah. He thought about her the way he thought about her now, not with the floor-falling-away quality of the early years, but with a clearness that had its own kind of sadness in it, and also something else, something that didn't have a name he'd found yet but felt like it was on the right side of things. She would have had something specific to say about this year. She would have teased him about the flannel shirt in the auditorium and been right to. She would have asked him what he was going to do about the Vantage offer with the directness of someone who already knew what he was going to do and was waiting for him to catch up. He set the airplane back on the windowsill. He went to check on Lily. She was asleep, turned toward the wall, Gerald the rabbit in a new position that suggested some negotiation had happened during the night. The horsebook was on the nightstand. The window let in enough light to see the angle of her jaw, the relaxed brow. She looked like her mother when she slept. She always had. He stood in the doorway for a while. Not long, just long enough. He went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with the Vantage contract documents and a pen. He read through them once, not scanning, actually reading, the way he read aircraft documentation, looking for the gaps between what was written and what was meant. The documents said what Evelyn had said they said. They were clean and specific and did not contain surprises. He sat with the pen for a moment. He thought about Rosa, who would be in the hangar on Monday morning, the same as always, her back pocket rag, her unhurried pace, her observations that had been true before anyone listened and would keep being true regardless. He thought about Dom, who had found out in a single year that his instincts were worth trusting and would spend the rest of his career building from that. He thought about Marcus and his margin notes and his 2022 memo that had gone unanswered, and the particular satisfaction of a man who had been right about something for 3 years and had finally been allowed to be right about it out loud. He thought about the 43 aircraft, the families that hadn't known anything was wrong, Walsh's 3 kids booked on a flight for next week, the 12 fractured components laid out on a cloth in order from least to most, telling a story that nobody else could read at the time. He thought about what it meant to do work that matters, and whether you get to choose what kind of meaning it has, or whether the meaning is in the doing and you find out what it is after. He signed the contract on the last page, at the bottom, in the same handwriting he'd had since high school, slightly cramped, a little fast, the handwriting of someone who writes to record rather than to be read. He put the pen down. He looked at the 2 airplane drawings on the refrigerator, the old one with the yellowed tape, the new one with the rainbow. He looked at the toy airplane on the windowsill. He looked at the kitchen where the French press with the electrical tape around it was sitting on the counter, and the 2-burner stove, and the window above the sink that looked out over the parking lot. He got up and made a note on the back of an envelope to call Evelyn in the morning. Then he wrote a second note on a separate piece of paper that said, "Tell Dale." He put it next to the first one. He turned off the kitchen light. He slept. The thing about the toy airplane, the one Sarah had bought, the one Lily had carried everywhere and then stopped, the one Mason had been taking to work in his shirt pocket for years and had somewhere along the way started leaving on the windowsill, was that it was not a perfect object. The landing gear he'd repaired was slightly uneven if you looked at it from the front. The chrome had worn off the nose from years of being handled. There was a small dent in the tail section from some impact nobody could remember anymore. It had been broken and fixed and carried and set down and picked up again, and it showed all of that. That was what made it what it was. Evelyn would ask for it eventually. Not that day. Not the day Mason called to confirm the contract. Some weeks later, during a routine Tuesday when they were walking through a protocol update, and she stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, out of nowhere, "Can I see it?" The airplane. He took it out of his jacket pocket. He'd started carrying it again, sometimes, on the days that felt like they needed it, and handed it to her. She turned it over in her hand. She looked at the landing gear, the worn nose, the dented tail. She held it the way people hold things that belong to someone else, carefully, with the knowledge that the weight of it is not yours. "The landing gear," she said. 3 hours, he said. "The parts are smaller than they look." She turned it once more and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. He put it in his pocket. Later, months later, after the things that needed to settle had settled, after the work had found its rhythm, he would come into Evelyn's office for a Tuesday morning check-in and find the toy airplane on her desk. Not his. A different one. Identical model, same chrome finish, still new enough that the nose was sharp and the landing gear was straight. She'd found it somewhere, ordered it, placed it on the corner of her desk where the light from the window could reach it. She didn't explain it. He didn't ask. Some things don't need explaining. They just need to be where they are, in the light, visible to anyone who knows what they're looking at. Mason Cole sat down across from Evelyn Hart in a glass-walled office, on the second floor of a building he'd driven to, thinking he was just fixing something and had ended up changing something. And they got to work, and the airplanes on the tarmac below them were all flying, and everyone on them was safe. And the toy airplane on the desk between them caught the morning light the way it always had, worn and real and entirely itself.